There are details hidden inside every Pokemon game that most players will never notice. Facts so quiet and so small that they exist almost entirely in the background, patient and still, waiting for someone to look closely enough. Generation after generation, these details accumulate. A number tucked into a Pokédex entry, a sound effect borrowed from a forgotten corner of the series, a mechanic that activates only under conditions so specific that most players will go their entire lives without ever triggering it. The Pokemon world is wide and it is deep, and somewhere beneath the surface of every route and every town, there is something almost invisible resting in the code. And before we drift any further, consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. The facts ahead are quiet ones, small observations, and gentle details that have no urgency attached to them at all. They are simply things worth knowing before the night gets too heavy. Each one is a light left on in an otherwise dark hallway, a detail someone placed there carefully, knowing that most people would never find it. Slowpoke is one of the most recognizable Pokemon in the entire series, and yet one of its most defining qualities is almost never discussed directly. According to its Pokédex entries across multiple generations, Slowpoke does not feel pain in the way other creatures do. When something bites the tip of its tail, it takes Slowpoke approximately 5 seconds to register that anything has happened at all. By the time the sensation reaches its brain, the thing that bit it has usually already let go and wandered away. The pain arrives late to a party that has already ended. This detail appears in entries stretching back to the very first generation of games. It is not a later addition, not something the designers added once they had more space for flavor text. It was there from the beginning, a foundational quality that shaped how Slowpoke was meant to be understood. It is not simply slow in its movement. It is slow all the way through, from the tips of its extremities to the very center of its awareness. What makes this particularly interesting is the way the games use this detail, not just as trivia, but as mechanics. Slowpoke's evolved form, Slowbro, comes into existence when a shelter clamps onto Slowpoke's tail. Slowpoke, true to its nature, apparently does not notice this for quite some time. The Pokédex describes the arrangement as almost accidental, something that happened and then simply continued happening because neither creature had a strong opinion about changing it. There is something almost meditative about this relationship when you consider it long enough. Two creatures bound together by inertia and mutual indifference. Slowpoke not bothered by the shelter fed by the residue on Slowpoke's tail, both of them drifting through the world at the same unhurried pace. It is an evolutionary outcome that required no conflict, no competition, no urgency of any kind. The Pokédex entry for Cubone, one that appears in the original Red and Blue games, describes it as a Pokémon that wears the skull of its deceased mother on its head. This detail has been widely discussed, but what tends to be overlooked is a quieter mechanical fact buried beneath it. In the original games, the way this entry was written left a genuine ambiguity about what was happening on Cinnabar Island. There is a location in the original Pokémon games, accessible through a specific combination of glitch conditions, where a Pokémon called Missing No appears. Among the various theories players developed about the origins of this glitch entity, one connected it loosely to narrative elements surrounding Cubone and its evolutionary line. These theories were never confirmed officially, but the fact that they arose at all is a reflection of how much emotional weight the designers placed into what began as a single Pokédex line. Cubone cries at night, the entry notes. The tears it sheds fall onto the skull it wears, and the skull rattles from the sound. This is not described as unusual within the world of the games. No other character reacts to it with alarm. It is simply a thing that happens, the way rain happens or seasons change, an accepted fact of the natural world that has found its way into a children's game. The entry for Marowak, Kubona's evolution, is equally quiet in its sadness. It has overcome its grief, the Pokédex says in certain versions. It has faced its sorrow, accepted it, and become something more resilient on the other side. For a franchise aimed at young players, this arc of grief and recovery is handled with a gentleness that rewards patience. Farfetch'd has been part of the Pokémon series since the very first generation, and its design contains a detail that is easy to read as decorative, but carries more meaning than it appears to at first glance. The leak it carries is not simply a visual quirk. According to its Pokédex entries, Farfetch'd cannot survive without the stalk of leek it holds. The plant serves as food, as a weapon, and as something the Pokémon guards so fiercely that it will fight to protect it even when the situation is otherwise hopeless. Different entries in different generations emphasize slightly different aspects of this relationship. Some describe the leek as the most important possession Farfetch'd has. Others note that the Pokémon becomes despondent and unstable if separated from it, wandering without direction. One entry mentions that Farfetch'd judges the quality of its leek, constantly discarding bruised stalks in favor of fresher ones, which means its attachment is not sentimental in the way a human might be attached to an heirloom. It is practical and immediate, a dependency renewed rather than inherited. The detail that Farfetch'd was once hunted nearly to extinction because its meat and its leek were both considered delicacies appears in several early entries and is one of the more unusual facts the series has ever committed to in official text. The games do not dwell on it. They state it plainly and move on, but it leaves a distinct texture on the Pokémon, a reason for its wariness that feels grounded in something more specific than most Pokédex entries attempt. In Galar, Farfetch'd received a regional variant and an evolution called Surfetch'd, which wields a larger leek as both sword and shield. The evolution was framed as something achieved only by Farfetch'd that had fought in a great many battles, the leek worn down to a specific condition through sustained use. The path to evolution was mechanical, requiring a fixed number of critical hits in a single battle, which meant the game embedded the Pokédex lore directly into how the creature developed in your hands. Gengar casts a shadow that does not quite match its shape. This is not accidental. Several Pokédex entries across the series note that Gengar's shadow is slightly off, behaving in ways that shadows should not behave, shifting when it should be still, remaining when the light source moves. The effect is described as deeply unsettling to anyone who notices it. What is less commonly discussed is the relationship between Gengar and Clefable that some Pokédex entries hint toward. In Fire Red, Gengar's entry notes that it is said to be a shadow of a Clefable that lost its life. This connection between the two is not explored elsewhere in the games in any explicit way. It simply sits in that single entry, a suggestion rather than a statement, the kind of detail that changes slightly how you see both Pokémon without requiring any further confirmation. Gengar belongs to a trio of ghost types in the original games, alongside Ghastly and Haunter, and all three are notable for being the only Pokémon in the original 151 that could not be obtained without trading. Haunter, specifically, would only evolve into Gengar when traded to another player. This mechanic was never explained within the fiction of the game. It was a design constraint that became part of the Pokémon's identity, a creature that required connection to exist in its final form. There is something fitting about that, and considering Gengar's entries often describe it as a Pokémon that was once a human or that lingers near people out of some need for contact it can no longer satisfy directly. The trade requirement reads differently once you know what the Pokédex says about the creature. It is not just a quirk of the game's mechanics. It is a Pokémon that cannot fully become itself in isolation. The name Pokémon, contracted from pocket monsters, was chosen for the international market because the original Japanese name was considered difficult to trademark cleanly across multiple territories. The franchise launched in Japan in February of 1996, and the process of bringing it to international markets involved a significant number of revisions that went far beyond translation. Some Pokemon names were entirely reconstructed, their original Japanese wordplay replaced with English puns that aimed for similar emotional texture without being direct translations. Arcanine is one of the more interesting cases in this regard. Its Japanese name, Windy, carried a straightforward reference to wind and speed. The English name Arcanine is built from arcane, suggesting mystery and ancient power, which pulls in a slightly different direction. Both names are defensible given the Pokemon's appearance and entries, but they emphasize different qualities. The Japanese version prioritizes velocity. The English version prioritizes mythology. This kind of divergence appears throughout the series and sometimes creates interesting gaps between what different players assume about a Pokémon based solely on its name. Players who grew up with the Japanese names and players who grew up with the English ones can end up with slightly different intuitions about the same creature, each intuition drawing on legitimate elements of the design. The decision to name the franchise Pokémon for international markets rather than pocket monsters also had long-term effects on how the series was perceived outside Japan. Pocket monsters is a more transparent description of the game's central mechanic. Pokémon is more abstract, more brand-like, and arguably more flexible as a term that could accommodate the franchise's expansion into trading cards, animated series, films, and merchandise without feeling limited by its original meaning. Raichu, the evolution of Pikachu, has a detail in its Pokédex entries that becomes more interesting the more you think about it. In several generations, entries note that Raichu can become aggressive and difficult to handle if it stores too much electrical charge. The electricity, if not discharged regularly, builds up in ways that affect the Pokémon's behavior and temperament. It is not simply energized by this buildup, it is destabilized by it. This creates an interesting contrast with Pikachu, whose entries describe a creature that discharges electricity naturally and frequently, sometimes by accident, sometimes as a form of communication. Pikachu sparks when startled, when happy, when threatened, and during play. The discharge is constant and involuntary, which means Pikachu rarely reaches the dangerous threshold that Raichu can approach. One possible reading of this, though not one the games ever make explicit, is that evolution in Raichu's case is not straightforwardly beneficial in every dimension. Raichu is more powerful, more capable of delivering devastating attacks, but it also requires more careful management of a resource that Pikachu simply vents without thinking. The evolved form has to actively manage something the pre-evolved form handles automatically. This detail has been used by fans to partially explain why Ash's Pikachu in the animated series never evolved. The in-universe reasoning given across various episodes points to Pikachu's preference for its current form, which is consistent with the game's mechanics, where evolution requires an item and can be withheld. But the Pokédex detail about Raichu's temperament issues adds a layer that makes the decision feel less arbitrary. The Safari Zone is a location that appears across multiple generations in various forms, and one of its most consistent qualities is a rule that feels at first like a simple game mechanic, but carries an interesting implication when examined more carefully. In the Safari Zone, players cannot use their own Pokémon to battle wild Pokémon. The usual loop of weakening a wild creature before catching it does not apply. Instead, players must rely on bait, rocks, and luck, with the added pressure of a limited number of steps before being ejected. The reason for this rule is never stated within the game itself. The Safari Warden offers no explanation beyond the existence of the rule. Some players assume it is a game design choice meant to create variety, which it is, but the in-universe implication is that the Safari Zone operates as a preserve, a managed space where the usual practices of Pokemon catching are suspended in favor of something that mimics a more naturalistic interaction between human visitors and wild Pokemon. What makes this detail worth noting is how it sits slightly apart from the rest of the game's logic. Most of the Pokemon world presents the act of capturing Pokemon as largely neutral, something trainers do and wild Pokemon accept within the understood rules of their world. The Safari Zone introduces a context where those rules feel different without the game fully committing to explaining why they feel different. It is a space with its own atmosphere, and that atmosphere has weight. The Safari Warden himself, who appears in red and blue as a character who has lost his teeth and requires the player to retrieve them, is one of the more unexpectedly specific side characters in the original games. The detail of his missing teeth exists purely as a quest trigger, but it is the kind of grounded human detail that the series early on was unusually comfortable including. Lapras carries one of the more melancholy Pokédex entries in the original games, describing a creature so gentle that it allows humans to ride on its back, and noting that this gentleness, combined with its large size and impressive traveling speed, led to it being hunted to near extinction. The entry in red and blue states this plainly. It notes that the few that remain are distrustful of people. The implication is that the trust they once offered freely was used against them, and the current generation has inherited the wariness that the previous generations learned too late. This is a weight that the games carry without comment. You obtain Lapras as a gift in one of the later cities, given to you by a silently sympathetic NPC, and then you use it to cross water for the rest of the game. The Pokédex entry sits in the background of that entire experience, a quiet reminder of what the creature you are using has survived. Later generations soften this somewhat. Lapras appears in later games without the same explicit reference to near extinction, though the gentle cooperative quality remains consistent across all its entries. The Alolan form of the region does not introduce a new form for Lapras, but Pokémon Sword and Shield gave it a Gigantamax form and used it prominently in the game's opening moments, framing the creature as something worth protecting rather than something fragile and endangered. What remains consistent across every version is the sense that Lapras exists in a different emotional register than most Pokémon. It does not seem fearsome or competitive or wild in the way many others do. It seems like it is trying to trust something that has not always deserved that trust. Jigglypuff's microphone is technically a marker, not a microphone. This is a detail that most players who grew up with the animated series already know, but the specific history of how this became part of the character is interesting regardless. In the original games, Jigglypuff carried no item and had no accessory. It was simply a round pink Pokemon that knew Sing and Pound. The singing was purely a battle mechanic. The animated series, in developing Jigglypuff as a recurring character, invented the performance aspect of the creature's personality, the need to be heard, the rage at falling audiences, the marker used to draw on the faces of those who fell asleep during the song. This characterization was popular enough that it began to influence how later games presented the Pokémon. By the time Super Smash Bros. Included Jigglypuff as a playable character, the microphone marker was treated as canonical, even though it originated outside the main series games. This kind of feedback loop between the games and the animated series happened more than once in the franchise's history, though not always in as clean a form as the Jigglypuff example. The animated series and the games were developed on parallel tracks and shared character designs, but operated with different storytelling priorities, and occasionally one would introduce an interpretation of a Pokémon that the other would later absorb. Jigglypuff's Pokédex entries describe it as singing continuously until its audience falls asleep, then being disconsolate at the loss of its listeners. The marker became the logical extension of that emotional arc, a way for the creature to express frustration at the gap between the care it puts into its performance and the response it receives. Ditto has only one move in the original games, or rather, only one move it uses by default, which is Transform. When it enters battle, it copies the opposing Pokémon's form, moves, and stats, becoming for all practical purposes a mirror of whatever it is facing. This makes Ditto one of the more conceptually unusual Pokémon in the series. It has almost no independent battle identity. It exists entirely in relation to others. What makes this interesting from a design perspective is how completely the mechanic captures something about the creature's nature. Ditto's Pokédex entries describe it as being able to transform perfectly into anything it sees, though several entries note that it has difficulty with transformations from memory, requiring a direct visual reference to execute the change cleanly. The implication is that Ditto's ability is perceptual and immediate, rather than imaginative or reconstructive. One of the quieter facts about Ditto is that its transform is, across most mechanics in the games, imperfect in exactly one specific way. When Ditto transforms, it retains its own HP value, rather than taking on the HP of the Pokémon it is mimicking. This means a Ditto transformed into a Snorlax has Snorlax's defenses, but Ditto's original hit point total, which is substantially lower. The disguise is nearly complete, but the thing underneath is still vulnerable in the way it always was. The relationship between Ditto and the Mew theory, which was widely circulated among early players and suggested that the two shared genetic material that allowed Ditto its unusual flexibility, was never confirmed officially, but it shaped how a generation of players understood both Pokémon, giving Ditto a mysterious gravity it might not otherwise have accumulated on its own. Pokémon Gold and Silver introduced a mechanic called the Day and Night system, which was one of the most significant additions to the series at the time. The game tracked the real-world clock on the Game Boy Color's internal timer and adjusted the game world accordingly. Certain Pokémon only appeared at night. Others were exclusive to mornings. Some events only triggered on specific days of the week, and a handful of the most memorable ones were tied to single days on the calendar. The Pokémon encountered by surfing in the pond at Mount Moon Square changed depending on whether the Clefairy had danced there that evening, which happened only on certain Monday nights. After the dance, the water yielded different encounters at different rates for the rest of that evening, a change that most players who visited during the day or on any other night of the week never noticed. This level of detail in a game released in 1999 for a handheld device with significant processing limitations is the kind of thing that becomes more impressive the more context you give it. The developers were working under constraints that made every additional variable expensive in terms of memory and processing power, and they were spending that budget on things that the vast majority of players would never experience. There is something generous about that. Not showy, not designed to be marketed or demonstrated, just a thing placed carefully into the game for the small number of players who happen to be in the right place on the right night. The berry system in Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire was built around a clock function on the Game Boy Advance cartridge that tracked real time to determine when planted berries would be ready to harvest. When players transferred saves to later games without the original cartridge, or when the internal battery of the cartridge died, the berry growing function ceased. Berries already in the player's inventory remained usable, but the ability to grow new ones from scratch was gone. This created a strange preservation problem for players who returned to older saves years after first playing. The game would still load, characters would still be where you left them. The same Pokémon would still be in the party and in the boxes, levels unchanged, items intact. But the garden would be permanently frozen. Whatever had been planted before the battery died would remain unready, suspended in a state of almost growth that would never resolve. Players discovered workarounds over time, ways to replace batteries or restore the clock function, but the underlying detail is a reminder that games contain layers of time within them. The save file captures a moment, and that moment persists as long as the hardware cooperates. When the hardware ages beyond its design lifetime, the captured moment begins to erode in ways that feel surprisingly specific. The berries themselves varied considerably in what they did, from restoring HP or PP to raising a Pokemon's friendship to countering specific status conditions. Some of the rarest berries were only distributed through events. The e-reader cards that required a peripheral device only released in Japan, and if transferred forward through sufficient generations, they would transform into the Enigma Berry, an item described with deliberate vagueness that recovered a quarter of a Pokemon's HP when it was struck by a move that was especially effective. Magikarp is commonly discussed as the weakest Pokemon in the series by a significant margin, and its Pokédex entries lean into this characterization with unusual enthusiasm. Various generations describe it as virtually worthless, incapable of meaningful battle, something that lives in still water because it lacks the strength to swim against any current at all. One entry notes that it can jump nearly a meter in the air, which is offered without irony as something impressive about the creature. What is less commonly discussed is the specific detail about its evolution threshold. Magikarp evolves into Gyarados at level 20, which in the original games required a significant investment of time from a player who did not want to use experience share or have other Pokemon weaken opponents first. The Magikarp sold by a merchant in the original games for 500 Pokédollars was mechanically a legitimate purchase, but one that required patience as its primary cost. Gyarados, the creature that emerges from this investment, is described in its own Pokédex entries as a creature so destructive and so furious that entire towns have been burned to the ground by single rampaging individuals. Its appearance is serpentine and enormous, bearing almost no visible relationship to the small flopping creature it evolved from. Entries across multiple generations describe it as becoming enraged during evolution in ways that it never fully recovers from. It is permanently changed by the process in ways that go beyond the physical transformation. The distance between Magikarp and Gyarados is one of the franchise's most deliberate emotional contrasts, an argument made entirely through gameplay and lore that transformation is possible and that the cost of it is real but survivable. The Pokemon Electrode, the evolved form of Voltorb, is notable in one specific way that rarely comes up in broader discussions of the series. It is, according to its Pokédex entries, the Pokemon most likely to explode without any external provocation. The entries describe it as volatile in a fundamental sense, not triggered by threat or anger, but by some internal pressure that builds without cause and releases without warning. One entry notes that it can explode for no discernible reason at all. This detail is consistent across generations in a way that feels almost deliberate on the part of the designers. Most dangerous Pokemon are described as reactive. They attack when threatened, when territorial instincts are triggered, when prey is within range. Electrode is described as unpredictable in a way that removes the comfort of knowing what to avoid. There is no behavior to steer clear of. The explosion simply happens. The move Self-Destruct and its more powerful variant Explosion are learnable by Electrode and Voltorb quite early compared to most Pokemon that can use these moves, which is a mechanical reflection of this personality trait. They are built around detonation. It is not a last resort for them the way it is for a Snorlax or a Golem. It is closer to a natural expression. Voltorb and Electrode are also among the only Pokémon in the original games that are easily confused for items on the overworld, a detail that the series has acknowledged directly through the Voltorb flip minigame in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which built an entire gambling mechanic around the creature's tendency to appear where a Pokeball should be. The sound design in the original Pokémon games was built within constraints so severe that the composers working on the music deserve significantly more recognition than they typically receive. The Game Boy's sound chip produced audio through 4 channels, one of which was dedicated to noise for percussion effects, one was a wave channel, and 2 were square wave channels for melodic content. Everything players remember from the original games, the opening fanfare, the Pallet Town theme, the battle music, the haunting Lavender Town arrangement, was constructed within these 4 channels. Junichi Masuda, who composed the music for the first games and later became a prominent figure in Game Freak's development structure, built the soundtrack under conditions that required every decision to be extremely deliberate. There were no spare channels, no room for texture or atmosphere beyond what could be accomplished with the available tools. The emotional range achieved within those constraints is something that continues to be studied by composers and sound designers working decades later. The Lavender Town music, in particular, has accumulated a mythology far larger than the game it came from. The composition, which uses dissonance and an unusual tonal palette compared to the rest of the soundtrack, was one of the first pieces of Pokémon music to be significantly analyzed by players outside Japan. Fond theories attached to it grew elaborate over time, some of them quite dark, all of them reflecting the genuine unease the piece produces, even in players who are aware of what they are listening to. The composition was revised for the Western release of the games, though the specific details of what was changed and why are not something that has been officially explained in detail. Slowking, the alternate evolution of Slowpoke introduced in Pokémon Gold and Silver, is obtained through a different item than Slowbro. Where Slowbro evolves when a Shelder bites its tail, Slowking evolves when a Shelder bites the tip of its head while holding a King's Rock. The difference in bite location corresponds, according to various entries, to a difference in what the venom does. The Shelder's venom, reaching Slowpoke's brain directly in the Slowking evolution, rather than resting at a peripheral nerve cluster, triggers an awakening of intelligence that Slowpoke does not normally possess. Slowking's entries describe it as profoundly wise, capable of solving any problem it encounters, speaking any human language, and growing more intelligent with each passing moment. The venom, which in the Slowbro case produces a pleasant tingling that the entry describes as somewhat enjoyable, produces something entirely different when delivered to the head. There is a Pokédex entry, in Pokémon Silver specifically, that states Slowking has an incredible intellect and extensive knowledge. However, it apparently forgets everything it has ever learned if the Shelder on its head is ever removed. This detail is tucked into one line of flavor text and never referenced again in any subsequent game. The implication is that everything Slowking knows, all the wisdom and accumulated intelligence the venom has produced, is dependent on the continued presence of a small bivalve attached to its forehead. The relationship between Slowpoke and the various Shelder that transform it remains one of the stranger symbioses in the series, and one of the few where the transformation appears to benefit the host more dramatically than the parasite, at least in the Slowking case. The Pokémon Absol appears before natural disasters, a quality that its entries describe as responsible for a long history of mistaken persecution. Humans living near Absol's territory learn to associate its presence with incoming catastrophe, and over generations this association became an assumption of causation. Absol was hunted and feared because it appeared before floods, earthquakes, and storms. The entries clarify across multiple generations that Absol does not cause these events. It senses them and arrives to warn humans who do not understand what it is trying to communicate. This is one of the more quietly tragic backstories in the franchise. A creature whose only unusual quality is the ability to perceive what others cannot, spending generations being punished for the perception itself rather than the thing being perceived. The disaster arrives regardless of whether Absol appears. The appearance simply means the disaster was sensed in advance by something trying to help. Later entries note that Absol has become increasingly rare as a result of this persecution, retreating to isolated mountain terrain where contact with humans is less frequent. The retreat is a learned behavior, an adaptation not to a physical environment, but to a social one, the accumulated consequence of being misunderstood across enough generations that avoidance has become instinct. Absol's design, which includes a sickle-shaped growth on the side of its head that some players rate as a blade or horn, reinforces the creature's misread quality. It looks dangerous in a way that feels intentional at the surface level and becomes a kind of visual irony once the Pokédex context is understood. The Sylph Scope, an item required to reveal invisible ghost Pokémon in the Pokémon Tower in the original games, is one of the most functionally specific key items in the series. Without it, the ghost Pokémon that appear in the upper floors of the tower cannot be identified or interacted with meaningfully. They appear as shadows, untargetable, and inexplicable, and the player must retreat and obtain the scope before returning. The Sylph Scope is obtained by defeating Giovanni in the Rocket Game Corner, which is one of the earlier story beats that connects the narrative threads of the game. The building that contains the Game Corner presents itself as an entertainment venue and conceals a criminal headquarters beneath it, an early example of the franchise's occasional willingness to present a world where things that appear benign contain something darker underneath. The Pokémon Tower itself houses both ghost Pokémon and human graves, a combination that the game treats with a straightforwardness that some players found surprising on first encounter. Mr. Fuji, who lives in the town at the base of the tower and is central to its narrative, was canonically connected in early Japanese materials to the backstory of Mewtwo, a connection that was significantly softened or removed entirely from the Western release. What remains in all versions is the tower's atmosphere, the music, the ghost encounters before the scope is obtained, and the sense that this location exists at a different emotional register from the rest of the game. It is not frightening exactly. It is simply heavier. Something about it requires a different kind of attention. Alakazam's Pokédex entries describe an intelligence that is, by the numbers given, among the highest attributed to any Pokémon in the series. Various entries across different generations specify its IQ as over 5,000, describe it as possessing a brain with more cells than any human brain, and note that it can recall everything it has ever experienced from birth without omission. Every moment, every sensation, every battle it has ever participated in is retained in complete detail. This level of retention is presented as a quality rather than a burden in most entries, though one or two descriptions hint at the weight of such comprehensive memory by noting that Alakazam's brain requires support from its psychic abilities to function. The physical frame of the Pokémon is not large enough to contain the brain it carries without assistance. The spoons it holds amplify its powers and help sustain the mental architecture that makes it what it is. The spoons themselves have a real-world context that is usually noted in discussions of the Pokémon. The Alakazam line was originally known as Edgar in early English promotional materials before the connection to Uri Geller. The real-world illusionist associated with spoon bending became clear. Geller later took legal action against the franchise over the design, arguing that Kadabra in particular constituted unauthorized use of his likeness and persona. The legal process was lengthy, and the character was largely withdrawn from trading card releases and certain other uses for a significant period before being returned. The situation is one of the more unusual intersections of real-world intellectual property disputes and a franchise built entirely around fictional creature design. Wobbuffet is described across its entries as a creature that never attacks on its own initiative. This is reflected directly in its battle mechanics. In the games, Wobbuffet can only use moves that are responsive rather than initiating. It counters physical attacks with counter, special attacks with mirror coat, and uses safeguard for protection. The fourth move, Destiny Bond, is the only aggressive option, and it only activates upon Wobbuffet's own defeat. The entries describe this passivity as instinctive rather than tactical. Wobbuffet is not a strategist holding back for the right moment. It genuinely does not attack first. Something in its fundamental nature prevents it from being the initiating party in a conflict. The blue body the entries describe as its true form apparently hides behind the more expressive head, using the obvious surface to absorb and deflect attention while the actual creature watches from somewhere less visible. In the animated series, Wobbuffet was used as a comedic recurring element attached to the antagonist team, appearing at unexpected moments and responding to serious situations with a cheerful salute that became one of the series' more recognized visual gags. The character's total passivity translated into a comedy of timing, the inappropriate enthusiasm of a creature that cannot engage directly with anything it encounters. The mechanic of being unable to switch out while Wobbuffet is on the field, created by its shadow tag ability, means that in competitive play, the creature functions as a kind of detention for opposing Pokémon. The passive nature of its attacks and the imprisoning nature of its ability exist in an interesting tension that the Pokédex never addresses directly. The move Splash has no effect. This is stated in the move description directly. The animation plays, the Pokémon leaps, and the turn is spent without any change to the battle state. It is, in this pure sense, useless. Magikarp learns Splash at level 1 and learns nothing else meaningful until much later, which is the context that most players encounter the move in first. The specific combination of an entirely useless move and a specifically helpless Pokémon was clearly intentional, a choice designed to communicate something about the creature before the eventual Gyarados evolution recontextualizes everything. The move exists to make a point. What is interesting is that Splash has never been given a use across any generation of the main series games. It has remained functionally empty for the entire history of the franchise. Some moves that once had limited utility have been revised and expanded over time. Splash has remained exactly what it was in the first games, a move that does nothing on a Pokémon that can barely swim. Hoppip, the small pink and green Pokémon from the second generation, also learned Splash. This is slightly stranger because Hoppip is not characterized as helpless in the way Magikarp is. It learns the move because it floats and jumps, and the move's name is connected to that physical quality, but the mechanical emptiness of the move still applies. A flying, floating creature that can call on the same leap as the weakest Pokémon in the franchise is a detail that passes without comment. The original Pokémon Stadium game for the Nintendo 64, released in Japan in 1998, was not the same game released internationally in 1999 and 2000. The Japanese original contained a smaller selection of Pokémon and different minigame content. The game that reached Western markets was substantially expanded, incorporating content that had been prepared for a planned sequel and releasing it as a unified product rather than two separate releases. The International Stadium games introduced the concept of rental Pokémon for players who did not have Game Boy cartridges to connect to the console, which addressed one of the more significant access barriers for a game that was primarily designed around the experience of bringing your own team to compete in an organized setting. The rental Pokémon were deliberately limited in their capabilities compared to well-trained player-owned Pokémon, which meant the rental option was a genuine fallback rather than a viable primary strategy. Stadium also included a transfer pack functionality that allowed players to see their Game Boy Pokémon rendered in full three-dimensional models, which was for many players the first time they had seen these creatures from multiple angles rather than as small sprite images. The models were not highly detailed by any standard that would develop later, but the novelty of seeing a Pokémon turn and move in 3 dimensions carried significant weight in 1999. The Professor Oak minigame included in the second Stadium game remains one of the more unusual inclusions in any Pokémon product, a quiz about the Pokédex that tested factual knowledge of specific entry details, evolution conditions, and move mechanics. It was optional content tucked into a sports-style competitive game, and it assumed a level of encyclopedic familiarity with the series that many players did not yet have. Poliwhirl's Pokédex entry in Pokémon Red describes the spiral pattern visible on its abdomen as the surface of its internal organs, visible through the translucent skin. This detail appears in some form across multiple early entries and is one of the more biologically specific notes the games commit to. The spiral does not rotate. It simply sits there, a permanent visibility into the creature's internal structure. The designer of the Poliwag evolutionary line has been cited as having based the visible organs on observations of real tadpoles, whose intestinal structures can sometimes be seen through their transparent bodies at early developmental stages. The translation from real biology into Pokémon design retained the specific visual quality, while abstracting the shape into something that reads as alien rather than anatomical. Poliwrath, the fighting type evolution of Poliwhirl, represents an unusual case in the franchise's approach to amphibious creatures. Most Pokémon that transition from water-focused to land-capable forms do so in ways that suggest the land adaptation is primary in the final form. Poliwrath's entries describe it as supremely adapted to both environments simultaneously, capable of swimming at speeds that outpace virtually any water-type Pokémon, and fighting on land with power that rivals dedicated fighting types. The combination is presented as the endpoint of the evolutionary line's central theme, which might be read as the maximization of physical capability in all available contexts. The spiral on Poliwrath's abdomen is still present, though in some entries the translucency of the skin is described as having reduced slightly with the final evolution, making the internal organs slightly less visible than they are in the pre-evolution stages. Steelix, the steel-type evolution of Onyx, was introduced in the second generation, and its Pokédex entries contain a detail that is both specific and unusual in what it implies. According to several entries, Steelix has been compressed by the pressure of existing deep underground for thousands of years, a process that has transformed the rocky material of its body into something harder than any mineral that occurs naturally. The hardness it achieves is described in some entries as greater than diamond. This is interesting not just as a description of the Pokémon, but as a claim about what sustained geological pressure over geological timescales can produce within the Pokémon world. The entries are describing a physical transformation that operates on a timeline most players interact with through a single traded Pokémon, but that implies a natural process occurring constantly in whatever equivalent of geological deep time the games occupy. Onyx, the pre-evolution, is already described as a creature that bores through the ground using its rocky body, consuming boulders as it goes. Steelix represents the endpoint of a creature that has existed in high pressure underground environments long enough for the rock to become something else. The trait evolution mechanic that triggers the transformation from onyx to steelix when a metal coat is held maps, loosely, onto this geological process, adding an external catalyst to what is implied to be a naturally occurring phenomenon at longer timescales. The visual transformation between the two, onyx's rough stone segmentation becoming steelix's smoother, more metallic plating, reflects this narrative with a clarity that rewards the comparison. Chansey, the normal type Pokémon associated with healing and care, lays eggs daily according to its Pokédex entries, and those eggs are described as nutritionally valuable enough to be used by humans and Pokémon alike. The egg it carries in its pouch is different from the egg it lays, serving as a kind of mobile nutrient reserve that it shares freely with anything nearby that is hungry or injured. This generosity is consistent across every entry the Pokémon has received, across every generation, making it one of the more ideologically coherent designs in the franchise. Chansey does not fight because it is aggressive or competitive. When it appears in battles in the wild, it is described as something of an anomaly given its fundamentally peaceful nature. It is capable of healing and evasion. It is not primarily built for offense. Nurse Joy's use of Chansey as an assistant in the animated series and the in-game Pokémon centers reflects this established character in a way that feels natural rather than forced. The creature was clearly conceived as a living embodiment of a specific set of values, and those values translate clearly into the contexts where it is used within the fiction. Blissey, the evolution of Chansey, extends these qualities in scale, if not in kind. The egg it carries is described as so delicious that anyone who eats it becomes, according to one entry, full of kindness and unable to fight. This is a claim about a food that changes the psychological state of whoever consumes it, an interesting detail in a franchise that generally keeps the emotional effects of food fairly mundane. The move, Thunder Wave, paralyzes the target, halving their speed and preventing them from acting on roughly a quarter of their turns. It has been a cornerstone of competitive Pokémon strategy since the original games, and its interaction with specific other mechanics has evolved significantly across generations in ways that reflect the ongoing refinement of the battle system. What is perhaps less discussed is the Pokémon that learn Thunder Wave through Level Up, and the way this list has remained remarkably consistent across the franchise's history. Electric types learn it early and reliably. A number of normal types access it. A small selection of others do as well, often reflecting their entry descriptions of having mild electrical qualities that are not their primary identity. The status condition system in the games as a whole reflects a specific philosophy about what battles in the Pokémon world involve. Status conditions are persistent, surviving the end of a battle in some early generations and requiring active removal to eliminate. They are not minor disruptions. They are changes to a Pokémon's condition that affect everything it does until addressed. The games treat them seriously in their mechanical design, even when the visual representation of paralysis or poison or confusion is fairly minimal. Toxic, the move that introduces badly poisoned status rather than regular poisoning, is one of the more mechanically interesting moves in the game's history because its damage scales over time. Doubling each turn, the target remains poisoned. In long battles, the accumulation of damage becomes substantial enough that the move represents a different kind of threat than most damage-dealing moves. It requires patience from the user, but punishes opponents who cannot resolve the condition quickly. Porygon was designed as the first artificial Pokémon, described in its entries as a creature made entirely of programming code. It exists only within digital space and was built by Sylph Company, the technology corporation that serves as a background presence in the original Kanto games. The entries note that it is the only Pokemon capable of moving freely through cyberspace, and that its programming allows it to be reconstructed from data even if its physical form is destroyed. The implications of that last detail tend to pass without much comment within the games themselves, but they are significant. Porygon exists in a way that is fundamentally different from biological Pokemon. Its continuity is not dependent on physical persistence in the same way. This is described neutrally in the entry, as though it is simply a feature rather than a philosophical curiosity. Porygon's reputation in the series outside the games is complicated by an episode of the animated series in which a battle sequence featuring Pikachu using electric attacks caused a significant number of children in Japan to experience photosensitive, seizure-like episodes. The episode was pulled from distribution and has never been officially rebroadcast. Porygon was the Pokemon being ridden in the sequence that featured the flashing lights, and despite being entirely blameless in the scene's visual construction, Porygon and its evolutionary descendants have been largely absent from the animated series since the incident. Porygon 2 and Porygon Zest both exist in the games and have been part of competitive play across multiple generations, but they remain notable absences from the animated series in a way that reflects a sensitivity about the original broadcast event that is not diminished with time. The Pokemon world contains a number of items that appear across multiple generations in consistent form, and one of the more interesting in terms of what it implies is the amulet coin. When held by the led Pokemon in the party during a battle against a trainer, the amulet coin doubles the prize money received at the end of the fight. It has been available in some form in virtually every main series game. What is curious about this item is how matter-of-factly the games treat an object that appears to function by altering economic reality. Prize money in the games represents what trainers carry with them, a sum they are obligated to pay upon defeat. The amulet coin does not change what opponents carry. It changes what the player receives. The gap between those two things is not addressed. The luck incense does the same thing and was introduced in later generations. Two items with the same effect suggest that the doubling of economic outcome was something the designers felt warranted more than one implementation, which in turn suggests it was a mechanic they wanted players to encounter through multiple paths. Items that affect luck or fortune appear throughout the series in various forms. The lax incense, the quick claw, the various berries that interact with critical hit rates, the wide lens, and its effect on accuracy. The game world is one where chance can be modified by carried objects, an interesting premise that the entries for these items rarely investigate beyond the mechanical description. Mewtwo was created through genetic manipulation of Mew's DNA, according to the backstory established in the original games and expanded in the animated series film. The diary entries found in the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island document the creation process, with entries that become increasingly disturbed as the experiment progresses. The scientists involved describe Mewtwo as growing stronger and more violent, exhibiting power they had not anticipated and behavior that moved in directions they had not intended. The final entry, which notes that Mewtwo has broken free, is the last record of human involvement in the project. What follows is the creature that the player encounters in the Cerulean Cave, alone, the product of a process that ended and left it without the context that produced it. Mewtwo's Pokédex entries in the original games describe it as the most savage Pokémon in the world, with a disposition described as brutal and cruel. These descriptions contrast sharply with the characterization developed in the first film, where Mewtwo is given interiority, a capacity for philosophical reflection, and a motivation that the entries do not address at all. The film was the first major challenge to the Pokédex as a definitive source of character information, presenting a creature whose entries describe cruelty and whose on screen presence describes something more like profound loneliness. Both characterizations have coexisted in how players understand Mewtwo since the film's release, and the franchise has generally allowed the ambiguity to stand rather than resolving it in one direction. Snorlax blocks roads. This is its primary narrative function in the original Kanto games, standing across two pathways until a specific item is obtained and a specific action is taken to wake it and send it on its way. After clearing the road, Snorlax can be caught or left to wander, and its role in the story is essentially complete. The simplicity of this narrative function contrasts with the detail in its Pokédex entries, which describe a creature that eats 360 kilograms of food daily and spends the remainder of its time sleeping. Its digestive system is described as processing everything it consumes without distinction, including food that would be toxic to most other creatures. Snorlax is not picky, and it is not fragile. It simply requires enormous quantities and then requires rest. The design of Snorlax is built around a quality that most Pokémon do not have, which is visible comfort. Most Pokémon in the series are depicted in poses that imply readiness, alertness, or some form of engaged state. Snorlax's default depiction is horizontal, eyes closed, hands folded over its stomach, fully at rest in a world where most creatures are permanently braced for something. This visual quality has made it one of the franchise's more beloved designs in merchandise and cultural reference contexts, and its use as a road obstacle in the games has become one of the most immediately recognizable set pieces in the series, despite being, functionally, a one-time puzzle solution that takes no more than a few minutes to resolve. The Pokémon series has included a number of event distributions over its history, Pokémon, and items made available through wireless distribution at specific locations during specific events or for limited windows through Nintendo's distribution infrastructure. Some of these distributions were geographically limited, some were time limited, a small number were tied to physical locations that no longer exist. Poképark, a physical theme park that opened in Nagoya in March of 2005, distributed event Pokémon through connection machines set up at the park during its brief operation. Players could connect their Game Boy Advance cartridges and receive eggs containing Pokémon with moves they could not learn through any other method. A Tailo that knew Feather Dance, a Pichu that knew Follow Me, an Igglybuff that knew Tickle. The park closed in September of that same year, 4 months after opening. Because the Pokémon were distributed as eggs, their characteristics were generated individually rather than being fixed. This means that the nature, gender, IVs, and shininess of each received Pokémon were determined separately for each player who participated in the distribution. The shiny probability applied normally. Among everyone who received a Tailo from the Poképark machines during those 4 months, a small number would have hatched a shiny version. That shiny Tailo with Feather Dance, if it exists and if it was transferred through the generations appropriately, would be among the rarest individual Pokémon anywhere in the world. Not for any competitive reason, simply because the conditions that produced it no longer exist, and because the number of people who could have received it was limited both by geography and by time. Unknown is a Pokémon that exists in 28 distinct forms, each corresponding to a letter of the English alphabet, along with an exclamation mark and a question mark. In the original Gold and Silver games, only the 26 letter forms were available. The punctuation forms were added in Crystal. Each unknown form is mechanically identical to every other. They all have the same stats, the same ability, and can learn only one move, Hidden Power, the type of which varies based on the Pokémon's individual values rather than its form. In competitive play, this means Unknown has essentially no utility. There is no version of it that is meaningfully different from any other version in terms of what it can accomplish in battle. The Pokédex entries for Unknown describe a creature of profound mystery. Some entries suggest that Unknown existed before written language, and that human alphabets may have been derived from the creature's various forms rather than the other way around. Others note that when many Unknown gather in one place, they generate a power that can alter reality itself. The Pokémon Silver and Crystal entries in particular describe this power as having something to do with the dreams and wishes of those nearby. The ruins of Alph, where Unknown appear in gold and silver, are one of the few locations in the series that reward extended exploration with content that does not resolve cleanly. Solving the puzzles at the site triggers Unown to descend into view, and radio static on the Pokegear produces a transmission in the area that has been analyzed extensively by players but never officially explained. The hold item system, introduced in the second generation, fundamentally changed how Pokemon could be built for competitive battles, and one of the first items to have a significant impact on the meta was the leftovers. Held by a Pokemon, leftovers restore a small fraction of the holder's maximum HP at the end of each turn. The effect is modest in any individual turn and substantial across a long battle, making it the preferred item for defensive Pokemon that expect to remain on the field for extended periods. What the item description and name imply about the economy of the Pokemon world is a small detail that tends to go unmentioned. The item is described as the uneaten remains of food, presumably Snorlax's food based on where it is first found in the original games, preserved and held for their restorative quality. It is, by this reading, a piece of someone else's meal that has been converted into a healing item through proximity to a creature with exceptional biological efficiency. The Pokemon world is full of items that function this way, converting the byproducts and remnants of one creature's existence into resources for another. Shed shells, scales, claws, feathers, and various secretions all appear as held items or consumables at various points. The franchise has always been willing to acknowledge the biological reality of its creatures without dwelling on it in ways that disrupt the overall tone. The competitive significance of leftovers has persisted across every generation of the games in which it appears. Few items have shown that kind of durability against the introduction of alternatives, and its continued relevance is a reflection of how fundamental regenerative ability is to Pokemon battle strategy, regardless of the generation it is played in. Haunter, the middle evolution of the Gengar line, is described in its entries as able to steal people's life force with a lick of its tongue. The entries in several early games are specific about this. One notes that anyone licked by Haunter will shake uncontrollably until they die. This was a standard part of the creature's flavor text in the original games in a children's franchise. This level of directness about lethality varies across the history of the series and tends to be more pronounced in early generations than in later ones. The original Red and Blue entries contain several descriptions of Pokemon behaviors that would be read as quite dark if they appeared in games aimed at similar audiences today. Haunter's Lick, Kadabra's psychic field destroying homes in the vicinity, Hypno's history of leading away a child, Drowsy's consumption of sweet dreams. None of these entries prompted official commentary at the time they were released, and the franchise addressed the darker notes in its lore primarily by softening subsequent entries rather than revising the original text. Players who discovered these details often found them more compelling than alarming, a recognition that the world the games described was richer and more complex than the surface presentation suggested. The Lavender Town entries are where this tendency is most concentrated. The ghost Pokemon found there, in the context of a tower full of graves, pushed the games into territory that they handled with a restraint that actually made the atmosphere more effective than explicit horror would have. The concept of Pokemon friendship, or happiness, is a mechanic that runs beneath the surface of the games in ways that have consistent effects but are almost never directly explained to the player. Certain evolutions only occur when a Pokemon has been raised to a sufficient happiness level. Certain moves change in power based on happiness. The return move grows stronger the higher a Pokemon's happiness, and the frustration move grows stronger the lower it falls. The happiness value itself is affected by a wide range of factors. Being healed at a Pokemon Center, leveling up, walking steps, being given vitamins and berries, winning battles, and receiving massages all increase it. Fainting decreases it. Using bitter medicines decreases it. Being allowed to languish in a box decreases it slowly over time in some games. What this system describes in aggregate is a Pokemon that notices how it is treated across a wide range of interactions. It is not just responsive to dramatic events. It registers the difference between being healed with bitter medicine and being healed with pleasant medicine, even though both restore HP equally. It responds to whether it is being walked around or stored. It knows whether it is winning or losing. The fact that this system exists and is mechanically meaningful throughout the games, affecting which forms certain Pokemon can take and how powerful their moves are, means that the games are quietly insisting on a particular understanding of what Pokemon are. They are not objects that the player acquires and uses. They are beings that experience their circumstances and develop relationships with the people who carry them. The Pokemon Delibird, introduced in the second generation, has become one of the more discussed examples of mechanical design choices that limit a Pokemon's utility to the point of unusability in competitive contexts. Delibird is an ice-flying type. It learns, through level up, only one move. That move is Present. Present is a move that calculates its effect randomly each time it is used. The majority of outcomes deal damage in varying amounts. One outcome heals the target. This means that a Pokemon with only one attacking option occasionally uses that option to restore the health of the opponent. It is fighting, with no ability for the player to prevent this outcome. From a competitive standpoint, this is a catastrophically designed Pokemon. No rational competitive team-building philosophy would include Delibird when the same resources could develop Pokemon without self-defeating mechanics. This is not a secret or a controversial read. It is simply the mechanical reality of a design choice made for reasons that were likely intended to be charming rather than practical. What makes Delibird interesting in retrospect is that its design concept, a Santa Claus-inspired delivery Pokemon carrying gifts in a bag formed from its own tail, is clear and coherent. The theming is fully realized. The choice to make its primary move a random gift-like outcome is entirely consistent with the concept. The problem is that consistent theming and competitive viability are not the same thing, and Delibird's design fully committed to one at the expense of the other. Later games have given Delibird access to more moves through TMs and breeding, which has slightly expanded what it can do in battle, but it has never become competitively relevant, and the present situation remains part of its identity regardless. The gym leader structure in the original Kanto region follows a type specialization pattern that was established in the first games and has remained the organizing principle of gym leader design across virtually every generation since. Each gym leader focuses on a single type, which gives their challenge a predictable quality that players can prepare for with the right Pokemon. What is less often discussed is how the gym leader's type specializations map onto a broader pattern that gives the regional progression an arc. The first gym introduces a relatively straightforward rock-type challenge. As the game progresses, The types become harder to counter simply by type advantage, with psychic types in Saffron and fire types in Cinnabar requiring more developed teams. The final gym before the Pokemon League uses ground types, which are strong but not uniquely difficult to address by that point in the game. Giovanni, the gym leader in Viridian City, who is also the boss of Team Rocket, uses ground types, and his dual role as both final gym leader and primary antagonist was one of the game's few genuine narrative surprises for players who had not been informed of it. The reveal that the obstacle at the end of the gym circuit was the same person you had been opposing throughout the entire story was the kind of structural decision that rewarded players who had been paying attention to the broader narrative. The Viridian Gym, which is closed at the beginning of the game, opens only after all other gyms have been completed. This sequencing places the final gym last regardless of any player choice, a linear gate in a game that otherwise allows significant freedom of movement between regions. Mew's presence in the original games is the result of a decision made late in development to include a secret Pokémon without making formal adjustments to the game's existing data structure. The technique used to access Mew in the original games exploits a specific condition related to how the game handles battle initiation and the variables it carries between encounters. The specific sequence of actions required to trigger the glitch was not documented in any official source at the time the game was released. The discovery of Mew through this glitch was one of the early examples of a gaming community, reverse engineering an unintended feature into something that functioned almost like official content. Players who followed the correct steps could obtain a genuine Mew with legitimate stats and the ability to be traded and battled normally. The fact that it was obtained through unintended means was for most players irrelevant to its in-game validity. The designer who hid Mew in the game's data shortly before the cartridge was finalized later described the decision as something he did almost on impulse, taking advantage of a small amount of unused memory without informing the broader development team. The Pokemon's existence in the final game was initially unknown to everyone who had not been directly involved in its placement. When the existence of Mew became public knowledge and players began to find it through the glitch, Game Freak allowed the discovery to serve as organic promotion for the franchise, eventually confirming Mew's existence officially and distributing it through limited events that required physical attendance at specific locations. The internal clock systems in the Pokémon games have created a relationship between the games and calendar time that extends well beyond the day and night cycles most players are aware of. In Pokémon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which remade the second generation games with full day and night systems, the days of the week triggered different recurring events, and the clock tracked them accordingly. Pokémon Gold and Silver tracked the birthday of at least one real person involved in development. Junichi Masuda's birthday, April 11th, increased the rate at which Pokémon eggs would hatch by 10% when the game's internal calendar matched that date. The effect was small enough to be imperceptible without specifically testing for it, which meant most players who happened to play on that date benefited from it without ever knowing they had. The game also reduced wild Pokémon encounter rates on dates corresponding to historical tragedies, treating these days with a quiet solemnity by making the world feel slightly stiller. This is the kind of design decision that exists entirely in the background of the player experience, affecting something measurable without calling any attention to itself. The relationship between a game's internal calendar and external events is one of the more unusual dimensions of what games can do that other media cannot. A book cannot be different on a specific day of the year. A film cannot modify itself for anniversaries or occasions. The Pokémon game's use of calendar sensitivity, even at this subtle level, represents something that is genuinely unique to the medium. The Pokémon Ditto, as previously noted, retains its own HP when transforming rather than adopting the HP of the Pokémon it copies. There is another limitation to its transformability that is less commonly noted. When Ditto transforms in the original games, the copies of the moves it acquires are each limited to 5 PPs regardless of the normal PP maximum for those moves. This means that an important battle strategy like Recover, which normally has 16 PP, would run out for Ditto after 5 uses. This is a constraint that becomes relevant only in very specific circumstances, and the original games provided enough of those circumstances that players discovered it through experience. The limitation was later revised so that Ditto copying a form with moves would receive 5 PP for each move, which was still capped, but consistently so across all possible moves. Ditto's relationship with breeding in the games is a separate mechanical area entirely. Because Ditto can breed with virtually any Pokémon capable of breeding, regardless of egg group, it serves as a universal breeding partner. This has made it one of the most practically sought-after Pokémon in competitive contexts where having a specific Ditto with high individual values can significantly simplify the production of competitively viable offspring. The desire for Pokémon from other regions' versions of Ditto comes from a mechanic called the Masuda method, introduced in Diamond and Pearl, which significantly increases the odds of hatching a shiny Pokémon when the two parents come from games with different language settings. A Ditto caught in a foreign language version of the game is therefore specifically valuable as a breeding partner in a way that no other Pokémon quite replicates. Some Pokémon have types that appear counterintuitive when first encountered. Gyarados is a water and flying type, despite being a serpentine creature with no visible wings and no particular relationship to aerial movement in its Pokédex entries. Its original Japanese entry describes it as spending most of its time in the depths of the sea, which makes the flying typing even harder to justify on ecological grounds. The explanation that has been offered within various official and semi-official contexts is that the Magikarp to Gyarados evolutionary line was designed before the type system was fully finalized, and the typing was applied after the basic designs were established. The Dragon type, which players widely consider more thematically appropriate for Gyarados given its serpentine form and the nature of its attacks, was already claimed by other Pokémon in the lineup, and the decision was made to use flying as the secondary type despite its tenuous relationship to the creature's described behavior. This kind of historical artifact of the design process is visible in several places in the original games. Certain Pokémon have types that seem disconnected from their visual design or their Pokédex descriptions in ways that suggest the type chart and the creature designs were developed somewhat independently and then matched up with imperfect alignment. The games have never revised Gyarados' typing, despite the availability of the Fairy type introduction in Generation 6 that similarly shuffled the type identities of several other Pokémon. It remains water flying, perhaps because the combination has become part of what Gyarados is, rather than something accidental about it. The move Minimize makes a Pokémon physically shrink in appearance and doubles its evasion. In the original games, this was a simple accuracy modifier. Over subsequent generations, the move accumulated additional properties in competitive play that made it increasingly controversial, primarily because a small number of moves were given guaranteed hit properties specifically against minimized targets, which was intended to create a counterplay to the strategy. The history of moves that were introduced as counters to specific strategies and then generated their own counter strategies in turn reflects the iterative nature of how the competitive meta develops and how the developers attempt to shape it. Minimize's evasion stacking was one of the earliest examples of a strategy that a large portion of the player base considered unfun to play against, and the game's response was to modify the move's interaction with specific other moves rather than limiting evasion stacking directly. The use of evasion boosting moves in competitive play has generated significant ongoing discussion about the philosophy of what winning through means other than direct damage represents within the rules of the game. Some players consider evasion stacking a legitimate strategy that tests an opponent's ability to adapt. Others consider it a rejection of the game's fundamental mechanic, which is damage calculation and type interaction. This debate has never been resolved because it is not ultimately a mechanical question, but a philosophical one about what kinds of strategies the game is designed to accommodate, and the game's design accommodates both interpretations simultaneously. Pokémon Black and White introduced a story structure that was more explicit in its thematic concerns than any previous game in the series, centering the conflict on a character whose argument about the ethics of keeping Pokémon in Pokéballs was sincere rather than purely villainous. N, the antagonist of those games, genuinely believed that Pokémon should be free from human partnership and that the system the games were built around was a form of exploitation. The game ultimately does not agree with this argument, but it does allow it to be made fully and thoughtfully, that the Pokémon the player bonds with through the game serve as evidence against N's position, but N's position is never made to seem stupid or malicious. He reached his conclusion through genuine experience with Pokémon who had been mistreated, and the gap between his conclusion and the game's conclusion is a matter of what evidence is representative rather than what evidence is real. This was a notable moment in the franchise's engagement with its own central premise. The games had always operated within an assumption that the trainer-Pokémon relationship was mutually beneficial and emotionally genuine. Black and White were the first games to give a main character who challenged that assumption a coherent argument rather than simply marking him as wrong by virtue of his antagonist status. N's team throughout the game consists of Pokémon he has recently encountered and then released, which means he never trains the same Pokémon twice in the way a traditional trainer does. The mechanical expression of his philosophy is built into how he plays the game. The Fairy type, introduced in Pokémon X and Y in 2013, was the first new type added to the series since the Steel and Dark types were introduced in the second generation 15 years earlier. The addition was made in part to address the competitive dominance of Dragon types, which had accumulated significant advantages over time due to their combination of strong offensive coverage and high base stats. Fairy types are immune to dragon moves, which fundamentally changed the risk profile of using dragon-type attackers. Previously, mirror matchups between dragon types were decided primarily by speed and power. After the introduction of fairy types, teams that included them could threaten dragon types with a type they could not hit neutrally, which created a structural incentive to diversify. Several existing Pokémon received fairy typings retroactively with the Generation 6 games, including some that had been typed as normal or psychic in previous generations. Clefable, Togekiss, Gardevoir, and Snubbull were among those reclassified. The change affected their resistances and weaknesses, which had mechanical implications for competitive teams that had been built around those Pokémon's previous type matchups. Jigglypuff became normal fairy rather than purely normal, which gave it an immunity to dragon moves it had not previously possessed. The change did not significantly affect Jigglypuff's competitive status, but it is one of the more notable type reassignments in the series, given the character's prominence in both the games and the broader franchise. The gym badges collected throughout the main series games affect not just progression, but the behavior of the Pokémon in the player's party. In the original games, Pokémon of increasingly high levels would refuse to obey commands from players who had not earned sufficient badges regardless of whether the Pokémon was obtained legitimately through in-game events or traded from another player. The badge requirement for obedience created a mechanical connection between the narrative of becoming a recognized trainer and the practical experience of commanding a powerful Pokémon in battle. A Pokémon that knew it was in the hands of an inexperienced trainer, as measured by official recognition, might simply decide not to follow instructions. This mechanic was primarily designed to prevent players from trading a single powerful Pokémon from a more advanced save and using it to trivialize the early game. But the fiction it created is interesting independently of that design motivation. The Pokémon world operates on a system of recognized authority, and a Pokémon's willingness to cooperate is partially determined by whether it respects the credentials of the person giving orders. The badges also activate various functions of HM moves outside of battle, with specific badges required to use moves like Surf, Fly, or Strength in the field. This created a sequence lock system that was entirely naturalistic within the game's fiction while serving a clear mechanical purpose. You did not unlock the ability to surf. You received the social recognition that led a Pokémon to accept Surf as an instruction. The magnet train in Pokémon Gold and Silver connects Goldenrod City in Johto to Saffron City in Kanto, and the pass required to board it is obtained through a lengthy side quest involving a missing machine part. The train itself, once accessible, provides one of the faster travel options in the game and serves as a physical reminder that Kanto and Johto are geographically connected regions rather than separate worlds. The design decision to include both regions in a single game was ambitious enough that it created a game significantly larger than most players expected. Completing the Johto gyms and defeating the Elite Four did not end the game. It opened Kanto for exploration, allowing players to revisit the locations from the previous generation and challenge those gym leaders as well. The Kanto that appears in Gold and Silver is slightly reduced compared to the original games, with fewer NPCs and slightly condensed locations, a reflection of the technical constraints involved in building two regions into a single cartridge. But the presence of familiar locations in a new context created a different kind of nostalgia than simple remakes would produce. Pallet Town visited after years away from it, Cinnabar Island changed by the volcanic activity that the entry for Blaine's appearance in Seafoam Island references. The world had continued without the player, and the evidence of that continuity was built into the geography. The detail that Blue, the rival from the original games, had become the gym leader of Viridian City in the intervening time was one of the more satisfying pieces of character continuity the series has produced, resolving a small ambiguity about where a character ended up in a way that felt earned. Pokémon contests, introduced in the third generation, games Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire offered an alternative to gym battles that was built around an entirely different set of values. Where gym battles rewarded offensive power, speed, and strategic use of type matchups, contests evaluated performance in 5 categories: cool, beautiful, cute, clever, and tough. Pokémon were judged not on damage output, but on how effectively they performed moves within the context of an audience's expectations. The contest system required players to think about their Pokémon's moves in a different register. A move that was weak in battle might be highly effective in a contest if it aligned with the right category and appeal sequence. Moves had not just battle properties, but contest properties, and building a Pokémon for contests involved a separate set of decisions from building one for the Pokémon League. The ribbons earned through contest victories were applied permanently to the Pokémon that earned them and persisted through trades and generations where the ribbon system was maintained. A Pokémon with a full complement of contest ribbons carried a record of those accomplishments wherever it went, a form of personal history attached to the creature rather than to the player. The contest system in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which remade the third generation games for the Nintendo 3DS, expanded the performance element significantly with full theatrical production values and an audience voting component. The core philosophy remained the same, an acknowledgement that a world built around Pokémon would develop multiple ways of appreciating them beyond combat efficiency. The move sketch, uniquely available to Smeargle, allows the user to permanently copy the last move used by the opponent. This makes Smeargle one of the only Pokémon in the series capable of learning virtually any move in the game's entire move pool, with a small number of exceptions. The exceptions are moves designated as impossible to sketch for balance or design reasons, including Struggle, the move used when a Pokémon runs out of PP for all its other moves. Smeargle evolves through level up, gaining the move sketch again at regular intervals, which allows a trained Smeargle to accumulate 4 sketched moves over the course of a playthrough. The process requires finding opponents that know the desired moves, allowing them to use those moves, and then successfully executing sketch before the battle ends or the situation changes. The practical use of Smeargle in competitive contexts comes primarily from the access to moves it can acquire through this process, particularly move combinations that no single Pokémon would otherwise be able to learn. The Spore move, which puts the target to sleep with 100% accuracy, combined with utility or setup moves, creates a Pokémon that can reliably establish specific battle conditions before any particular engagement begins. Smeargle's Pokédex entries describe it as using its tail to paint markings on everything in its territory, with different herds recognizable by the specific colors and patterns their marking tails produce. The sketch mechanic is a visual metaphor for this copying and rendering process, a creature whose defining ability is observation and reproduction applied to a competitive context in a way that rewards creative preparation. The Safari Zone mechanic that limits players to a fixed number of steps before ejection creates an interesting relationship between time pressure and catching methodology. Unlike regular encounters, where the player can exhaust a wild Pokemon's HP before attempting a catch, Safari Zone Pokemon can be approached only through items and direct throw attempts with no option to reduce their health. The optimal strategy in the Safari Zone was a subject of extended player theorizing in the early community, with various approaches tested and documented. The throwing of rocks, which increases catch rate, but also increases flight rate, against bait, which reduces flight rate but also reduces catch rate, represented a genuine decision tree that players could optimize given sufficient information about the base stats of the target Pokémon. Tauros was the most sought-after Pokémon in the original Kanto Safari Zone, a pure normal type with high attack and speed stats that made it competitively valuable in the early game's meta. Catching it required staying in the Safari Zone long enough to encounter it at the correct walking location, and then successfully catching it within the mechanical constraints of the area. The difficulty was high enough that many players who genuinely wanted a Tauros never obtained one through the Safari Zone. The animated series handled Tauros in the Safari Zone in a way that became famous for its own reasons. Ash spent a significant amount of animated time in the Safari Zone, catching Tauros repeatedly, resulting in a large number of Tauros in his party, which were then barely used across the remainder of the series. Pokémon Diamond and Pearl introduced a mechanic for modifying the underlying values that determine a Pokémon's battle effectiveness, allowing players who pursued it far enough to create Pokémon at the theoretical ceiling of what the game's numbers allowed. This process, called EVI training, or effort value training, had existed in less visible form since the original games, but Diamond and Pearl made the effect directly visible through the Super Training System's predecessor and documented it more clearly in competitive communities. The result was that a fully trained Pokémon with optimal effort value distribution and optimal individual values could outperform an otherwise identical Pokémon by a margin significant enough to affect battle outcomes. This created a layer of game that existed almost entirely outside the main story and required knowledge that the game itself communicated very poorly. Players who discovered this layer found it created a fundamentally different relationship with their Pokémon, where casual play involved forming attachments to specific creatures encountered during the story. Competitive preparation involved choosing creatures based on their hidden numerical values and training them according to a precise optimization plan. The Pokémon in the competitive context were not exactly the same objects as the Pokémon in the story context, though they occupied the same mechanical space. Both relationships coexist in the franchise, and the games have gradually made the optimization layer more visible without ever making it mandatory. The tension between the game as a story experience and the game as a strategic system has been one of the defining features of Pokémon for the entirety of its history. The move Baton Pass allows the user to switch out while passing any stat changes in some conditions to the incoming Pokémon. In early generations, this created a competitive strategy centered on accumulating multiple positive stat changes through setup moves and then delivering those changes to a powerful sweeper who could make full use of them. The Baton Pass strategy was controversial in competitive contexts for similar reasons to evasion stacking, not because it was against the rules, but because it produced a style of play that a significant portion of the competitive community found unsatisfying to play against. A Pokémon that had accumulated several attack boosts and speed boosts and then passed them to a creature that already had strong offensive stats could reach damage levels that effectively bypassed the game's intended balance. Subsequent generations introduced specific mechanics to counter bait and pass strategies, including moves and abilities that remove or reverse stat changes on the user or the target. The cat and mouse between offensive strategies and the tools designed to answer them has been one of the consistent engines of change in competitive Pokémon across every generation. What makes Baton Pass interesting as a design element, separate from its competitive implications, is the visual image it creates. A creature passing its momentum to a teammate mid-battle, the energy and advantage accumulated through effort, transferred rather than wasted. As a fiction, it is one of the more cooperative mechanics in a game that is primarily framed as a competition. Pokémon Snap, released for the Nintendo 64 in 1999, was one of the first significant spin-off games in the series and offered an experience entirely unlike the main series games. The player rode a vehicle called the 01 through on-rails courses populated by wild Pokémon and took photographs, earning points based on the size, pose, and placement of the Pokémon in each shot. The game was built around observation and patience rather than battle or capture. Pokémon had behaviors that could be triggered by throwing items, playing music, or simply waiting at the right point in a course. Learning these behaviors was the core puzzle element of the game, and finding the specific conditions that produced rare poses or drew out hidden Pokémon required the kind of careful attention that most games reward with combat victories, but Snap rewarded with a better photograph. Also, Professor Oak's evaluation of each photo created a scoring system that required the player to understand what the game considered a good shot. A Pokémon in the center of the frame, facing forward with other Pokémon visible in the background, scored higher than a partially visible creature, shot from a poor angle. The criteria were never fully explained in the game, but were learnable through experimentation. New Pokémon Snap, released in 2021, revisited this concept with substantially expanded content and far more detailed environments, maintaining the core philosophy of the original while significantly expanding the variety of behaviors and interactions available. The gap of over 20 years between the two games did not diminish the appeal of the core concept, which is perhaps the clearest evidence that the original occupied a unique enough design space to survive the wait. Meowth, specifically the Team Rocket Meowth in the animated series, learned to speak human language through a sustained effort motivated by romantic attachment to a Meowth named Meowsy who lived with a wealthy family. The origin story, told in a flashback episode, describes a Meowth who was rejected because he was poor and different, spent years learning to walk upright and speak human words, and was ultimately rejected again because the effort of becoming unusual had only made him more alien to the Meowth he was trying to reach. This is among the more emotionally substantive backstories assigned to a recurring character in the animated series, and it exists for a character who is primarily a comic figure in the present tense of the show. The tension between the Meowth, who tells jokes and causes mischief alongside Jesse and James, and the Meowth, who is carrying this specific history, creates a quiet depth that rewards viewers who pay attention to both registers simultaneously. The mechanics of Meowth speaking human language are addressed within the show's fiction as something extraordinary. Pokémon are depicted as capable of understanding humans, but not typically capable of producing human speech. Meowth is presented as an exception, and in the episode where his backstory is revealed, the cost of being an exception is what the story is ultimately about. The games have never given individual Pokémon dialogue equivalent to what the animated series provided for Meowth. The series' media gap between the two is significant and produces different understandings of what a Pokémon's interior life is like. The National Pokédex, which tracks all Pokémon across all regions, reaches entries that reflect increasing complexity as the series has grown. What began as 151 entries has expanded across generations to include over 1,000 individual species, each with at least one Pokédex entry in every game that uses a full Pokédex system. Writing these entries requires maintaining consistency, not just within a single game, but across the entire history of what has been said about each creature. A late generation entry that contradicts something stated in an early generation entry creates a discontinuity that is generally noticed by players who follow the series closely. The franchise has developed a tolerance for some degree of entry variation between generations, treating different entries as observations from different researchers rather than a single definitive document. This framing, that the Pokédex is a collective research document rather than objective fact, allows entries that describe behavior the creature has never been observed performing in-game, and entries that use adjectives like said to be or reportedly when describing the more extraordinary claims. It creates a texture of received knowledge rather than established fact. The entry for Yamask notes that the mask it carries was once its face when it was human, and that Yamask sometimes looks at the mask and cries. This entry has been cited frequently as an example of the franchise's occasional willingness to place genuinely affecting detail into what is ostensibly a reference database for a children's game. The Pokémon Spiritomb was introduced in Diamond and Pearl with a specific condition for obtaining it that required interaction with the Underground, the multiplayer sub-area accessible via the DS wireless connection. A specific item had to be placed in the underground area, and then the player had to speak with 32 other underground explorers before returning to the surface to find the item activated. This was one of the more demanding social requirements attached to obtaining a specific Pokémon, and players who attempted it alone discovered workarounds involving multiple DS systems and cartridges. The requirement was not repeated in the Heart Gold and Soul Silver remakes, where Spiritomb could be obtained through a different method that did not require multiplayer interaction. Spiritomb's design is built around its entry number in the National Pokédex and a specific set of numbers referenced across its entries. It is described as being composed of 440 souls bound into a strange keystone as punishment for unspecified misdeeds. The number 108, referenced in relation to Spiritomb in various entries, connects to the Buddhist concept of 108 earthly desires, a numerological detail that sits in the creature's lore without being directly explained. The lack of a normal type effectiveness on Spiritomb, whose typing gave it no weaknesses in the generation it was introduced, was addressed in Generation 6 when the fairy type was added. Dark Ghost typing had previously been resistant or immune to every type in the game. The introduction of Fairy as a counter to Dark gave Spiritomb its first weakness in over a generation of competitive play. The phrase Pokemon Professor is used throughout the series to describe a class of researchers who study the relationship between Pokemon and humans, provide the starter Pokemon to new trainers, and serve as the narrative introduction to each region. Each professor is named after a tree, a convention established with Professor Oak and maintained through every subsequent region. Professor Oak's name in English corresponds to the English tree name. The Japanese names for the professors use Japanese tree names, which has created an interesting cross-cultural naming situation where the same character has the same concept encoded in two different languages. The translation convention for the professor names has been maintained precisely enough that the tree naming pattern is clear in both the original Japanese games and the localized versions. The professors across the series have varied significantly in how central they are to the main narrative. Professor Oak in the original games is primarily a framing device, providing the initial motivation and appearing briefly near the end. Later, professors have been involved more directly in the stories, particularly in later generations, where the regional professor's research is sometimes tied to the central conflict. Professor Sycamore in the Kalos games is one of the more present professors across the story, partly because the region's narrative involves a large-scale threat that requires the professor's expertise directly. He is also notable for being the professor from whom players can receive a second starter Pokemon midway through the game, a one-time opportunity that was unusual in the series up to that point. The Pokemon trading card game, which launched alongside the video games in Japan in 1996, developed its own parallel history that intersected with the main series at numerous points without being entirely governed by it. Pokemon that were functionally weak in the video games could be powerful in the trading card game due to different mechanics, and vice versa. The early card game featured a rarity system that made certain cards extremely difficult to obtain through normal booster pack purchasing, a structure that created a secondary market and drove a collecting culture around the cards that was at least as powerful as the play culture. The holographic Charizard from the first set became one of the most culturally recognized individual cards in the product's history, not because Charizard was uniquely powerful in the card game's mechanics, but because its visual presence was striking and its rarity made it a status symbol. Later card sets introduced Pokemon-specific abilities that built a more nuanced strategic layer than the original card game offered, and competitive Pokemon trading card game has developed its own community and tournament structure that operates largely independently of the video game competitive scene. The intersection between card art and the video game designs has created a body of official artwork for each Pokemon that extends well beyond what the games themselves require, with multiple artists having produced distinct interpretations of the same creatures across decades of card releases. The legendary Pokemon of each generation serve structural narrative functions that have been consistent enough to constitute a formula, while varied enough to feel distinct across games. Each region's main story climaxes around access to, or conflict with, at least one legendary Pokemon whose power is relevant to the regional threat. And each region's postgame typically includes legendary encounters that extend beyond the central narrative. Ho-Oh and Lugia, the legendary Pokemon of the second generation, were unusual in that the primary encounter with each depended on which version was being played. Gold players encountered Ho-Oh atop the bell tower after gathering 3 special items and ringing the bell with a specific Pokemon. Silver players encountered Lugia deep in the Whirl Islands through a different set of conditions. The division made each creature feel like a genuine secret rather than a guaranteed story event. The Gold and Silver games were also notable for introducing Suicune, Raikou, and Entei as roaming legendaries that move throughout the overworld, making them extremely difficult to encounter repeatedly and even harder to catch in a single engagement. Players who attempted to catch the roaming beasts typically needed to research the specific conditions under which the encounter would be stable enough to attempt a catch. This approach to legendary availability, making some easy to find and others requiring sustained effort and specific knowledge, created a tiered sense of rarity that made the creatures feel meaningfully different from one another even before entering battle with them. Meryl was unofficially called Picablu by players in the period between the release of Pokémon Red and Blue in North America and the release of Gold and Silver, which introduced Meryl officially. The creature had appeared in the animated Pokémon movie preview and in promotional materials for the upcoming games, but no official English name had been announced. Playground legend attributed to it the name Picablus, suggesting it was a secret Pokémon that could be obtained through specific unverified methods in the games already released. This episode in the franchise's early fan history is one of the clear examples of how information scarcity produced its own culture around Pokémon. Players genuinely believed in Picablu because they genuinely wanted to believe in it, and because the games had already demonstrated through Mew that there were things hidden inside them that official materials had not disclosed. The leap from there to believing that a creature visible in preview footage could be obtained somehow was not large. The rumors about Pokémon that could be unlocked through specific impossible conditions, or found in inaccessible areas, or revealed by specific game cartridge combinations, populated the early fan experience in ways that are harder to understand now that information about any game is accessible within hours of its release. The playground economy of secret knowledge was a genuine feature of how players related to the games in their earliest years. Marill, when it was officially released, was entirely normal in its presentation. It was a small blue round creature with water-type affinity. It had no secret history, but the name Picablu persisted in how certain players referred to it for years after the official name was established. The Pokémon Wobbuffet, discussed earlier for its purely reactive battle style, has a secondary detail in its entries that connects to the design in an interesting way. The tail of Wobbuffet is described in multiple entries as its true form, with the large blue expressive body being a kind of decoy that it presents to enemies. The tail, which has a small face of its own, is what Wobbuffet is actually protecting when it displays the behaviors its entries describe. This detail is difficult to read initially because the tail seems like an afterthought, visually, a small dark appendage on a creature whose dominant visual feature is its large, round body. The entries invert this reading by specifying that the apparently prominent feature is the camouflage, and the apparently minor feature is the essential self. The darkness of the tail is explained in one entry as a sign that it hides something that must not be revealed. This is the kind of detail that accumulates meaning the more time you spend with it, not because it resolves into anything specific, but because it keeps generating questions. What is the Wobbuffet hiding in its tail? Why would evolution produce a creature that conceals its true form within an elaborate decoy? What advantage does this separation between appearance and substance provide? The entries do not answer these questions. They simply establish the premise and leave it there, one of the many places in the franchise where the Pokédex opens a door and then does not accompany you through it. The Pokémon world contains a number of items that exist purely as currency within specific contexts, and one of the more interesting is the Battle Point, or BP, system available in post-game facilities. Battle Points are earned through competitive battles in facilities like the Battle Tower, Battle Frontier, or various generation-specific equivalents, and can be exchanged for items not available through normal gameplay. The specific items available through BP Exchange have varied across games, but they have consistently included powerful held items, tutored moves, and training enhancers that make the competitive optimization process more efficient. The position of these items behind a competitive currency wall creates a structure where players who engage deeply with the competitive battle system gain access to tools that make the competitive battle system easier to engage with deeply. The Battle Frontier, introduced in Emerald and available in different forms in later games, extended this concept into a multi-facility competitive experience with different rule sets and challenges in each area. The most dedicated players could earn symbols and acknowledgments for completing each facility's challenges at the highest level, rewards that existed purely as recognition with no mechanical benefit beyond the pride of the achievement. The Battle Factory within the Frontier was notable for using rental Pokémon, requiring players to build teams from randomized available Pokémon and then trade those teams for opponents' rental Pokémon after each battle, creating a constantly shifting strategic environment where knowing the properties of a wide range of Pokémon was more useful than optimization of any specific team. The Pokémon series has addressed the question of Pokémon death through entries and story moments with varying degrees of directness depending on the game. The clearest acknowledgments of Pokémon death exist in locations like the Pokémon Tower and the Pokémon Cemetery in Lavender Town, which explicitly contain the graves of deceased Pokémon. The entries for Cubone, Marowak, and others in that narrative thread in the original games are among the most direct engagements with the topic. The ghost in the Pokémon Tower in the original games is identifiable through the Sylph scope as the ghost of a Marowak killed by Team Rocket, making it the first Pokémon in the series that the player has a direct story-connected encounter with after its death. This ghost cannot be caught. It can only be defeated, and defeating it is described within the fiction as laying the spirit to rest rather than simply removing a battle obstacle. The tonal care taken with this sequence, especially given that it is surrounded by a game that otherwise treats battles as sport, is one of the more thoughtful moments in the original Kanto games. Later games have addressed Pokémon death with varying levels of comfort. The Marnie and Morty story threads in the second-generation games involve ghost Pokémon and cemetery aesthetics without the same direct engagement with specific named death. The Lavender Town sequence remains the clearest single example of the franchise asking players to hold the possibility of a Pokémon's death with some emotional weight. Tyranitar's design is connected in its Pokédex entries to a concept that exceeds most battles the player will encounter it in. The entries describe a creature capable of leveling mountains, altering entire landscapes in the course of its movements, and doing so entirely casually. The geographic impact of a Tyranitar simply passing through an area is described as comparable to geological events. This scale of power is a common feature of late-stage pseudo-legendary and legendary Pokémon descriptions, but what makes Tyranitar's entries distinctive is the specific combination of geological metaphor and casual indifference. Tyranitar does not destroy mountains because it is angry or threatened. It does so as an incidental consequence of being what it is, moving through a world slightly too fragile for it. The design itself, which takes clear visual inspiration from Godzilla and similar kaiju from Japanese monster media, carries these proportions in its silhouette. It is built for a scale that the game's encounter format does not accommodate, which creates a permanent gap between what the entry describes and what the player experiences. You battle a Tyranitar on a small grid with limited movesets and turn-based interactions, while the entry describes a creature for whom that entire context would be an afterthought. This gap between entry description and gameplay experience is a consistent feature of the series, and it is part of what gives the Pokédex its particular quality. The entries describe a world the games can gesture toward, but never fully contain. The Pokémon League, which serves as the culminating challenge in every main series game, follows a structure established in the original games that has been maintained across every generation. The Elite Four are 4 high-level trainers, the player must defeat consecutively without resting between battles, followed by the champion. The champion holds the title until defeated, at which point the player character assumes it. What happens after this assumption varies subtly by game. In most games, the credits roll and the narrative concludes, with the world continuing in a state the player is no longer narratively central to. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the completion of the Johto League opens the Kanto region for exploration, placing the player in the same world, but indicating that the journey continues rather than ends. In certain later games, the credits are followed immediately by post-game story content that changes the narrative context established by the league victory. The champion in Black and White is unique in that the player is challenged for the title before the Elite Four is completed, with the previous champion arriving after the defeat of the antagonist to battle the player in the Champion's Hall. The sequence inverts the usual order in a way that serves the specific narrative of those games, where the champion's intervention is story relevant rather than purely a structural hurdle. Each generation's champion is designed to feel like a meaningful culmination, a trainer whose team reflects the themes of their region and whose defeats signals the player's full development from the beginning trainer of the opening scene. Regigigas, the legendary Pokémon introduced in Diamond and Pearl as the master of the Regitrio, is notable for possessing an ability called Slow Start that halves its attack and speed stats for the first 5 turns of any battle. Given that Regigigas has otherwise high base stats, this ability converts it from a powerful threat into something that is merely adequate for the duration of the turns in which it is most vulnerable to being defeated. Slow Start is among the most widely discussed examples of an ability that undermines a Pokémon rather than supporting it. The design rationale appears to be connected to the creature's lore, which describes it as a creator that has been dormant for so long that it takes time to reach full operation. The ability is a mechanical expression of this mythological narrative, trading competitive utility for thematic consistency. The debate around Slow Start reflects a broader question about what Pokémon abilities are for. If they are purely competitive tools, Slow Start is a failure. If they are expressions of a creature's character and narrative, Slow Start is one of the more successful abilities in the game at communicating something real about the creature it is attached to. The 3 Regi Pokémon that Regigigas is said to have carved from rock, ice, and steel as part of the myth surrounding the group are individually also below the power curve for legendary Pokémon in most competitive contexts, which creates a consistent thematic unity across the group that the competitive meta's judgment of their individual utility does not diminish. The move Transform, used by Ditto and learnable through certain other means, is one of the oldest moves in the franchise, and one of the few that have remained essentially unchanged in their fundamental function since the original games. Most early moves have been revised at least once in terms of power, accuracy, PP, or additional effects. Transform has stayed the same because any change would alter what it is in a way that would be difficult to contain. The implications of Transform for the creature using it were never fully explored in the main series games, where the focus is on the mechanical expression of the move rather than its philosophical dimensions. The animated series and various spin-off media have occasionally gestured toward questions about what it means for Ditto to become something else, whether identity persists through transformation, and what the experience of being many different things sequentially might feel like. The entry for Ditto in various generations sometimes notes that it finds transformation emotionally challenging, or that imperfect transformations cause it distress. Other entries describe it as perfectly comfortable with its nature. The variation between these characterizations across generations reflects the franchise's general approach to interiority, which is to suggest possibilities rather than commit to them. Ditto's single facial expression, the slight smile it wears in every form and in every game it has appeared in, is sometimes used as evidence for one reading or another of its interior life. A creature that always smiles regardless of circumstance might be content or might be wearing an expression that has no particular correspondence to its internal state. The move attract causes the target to become infatuated if they are of the opposite gender, resulting in a 50% chance of being unable to act on any given turn. The move's effectiveness depends entirely on the genders of the two Pokémon involved, and it has no effect between two Pokémon of the same gender or between a Pokémon and one that has no defined gender. The mechanic creates an interesting asymmetry in team building. A Pokémon of one gender facing an opponent of the opposite gender is vulnerable to a condition that an otherwise identical Pokémon of the same gender would be immune to. This has made gender a strategically relevant characteristic in certain competitive contexts, which is an unusual dimension for a creature's biology to occupy in a battle system otherwise built around type interactions and numerical statistics. The Pokémon with the ability Oblivious is immune to infatuation, regardless of gender, which creates a way to neutralize the mechanic through ability selection rather than gender selection. This kind of counter existing within the ability system rather than the type chart is typical of how the games handle conditions that feel thematically distinct from the main damage and type framework. The attract condition was one of several introduced in the second generation that moved the battle system away from pure damage calculation toward a wider range of strategic options. Infatuation, confusion, and the various sleep-related mechanics all expanded what could happen in a battle beyond the original game's relatively limited status condition set, and each of these additions required the designers to decide how strongly the mechanic would affect the fundamental loop of action trading between two Pokémon. The Pokémon Spiritomb, noted elsewhere for its unusual obtaining conditions in Diamond and Pearl, shares a specific quality with Sableye from the third generation. Both Pokémon possessed no weaknesses at the time of their introduction. Sableye was a dark ghost type, with no weaknesses before the fairy type existed. Spiritomb shared the same typing and therefore the same absence of vulnerability. When fairy type was introduced in the 6th generation, both Pokémon gained their first weakness simultaneously. This was clearly intentional rather than coincidental, a single design decision that affected two Pokémon in the same way as part of a broader structural change to the type chart. Sableye subsequently received a Mega Evolution in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire that gives it the Magic Bounce ability, which reflects status moves back at the user. The Mega Evolution also gives it massive increases in defensive stats, making it one of the more interesting defensive options in the competitive format that allowed Mega Evolutions, trading the weakness to Fairy type for enhanced survivability against everything else. The history of no weakness Pokémon in the franchise is short. The type chart was designed with enough interconnection that most type combinations have at least one vulnerability. Finding combinations that avoided all weaknesses was difficult enough that only these two dark ghost types achieved it before the type chart revision that created new vulnerabilities across the series. The Pokémon world's relationship to time operates differently in different games, and nowhere is this more evident than in the way each generation handles the concept of continuity between regions. When Gold and Silver included Kanto as an explorable region, accessible after the Johto League, the games implied that 3 years had passed since the events of Red and Blue, enough time for visible changes to the landscape and character positions without a complete overhaul of everything familiar. The changes to Cinnabar Island, where a volcanic eruption destroyed most of the town and left the landscape dramatically altered, were the most visually dramatic expression of this passage of time. The player could surf to what had been a developed island with a gym and a research lab and find almost nothing remaining, with the gym relocated and the mansion gone. The volcanic activity had not been predicted in the previous games. It simply happened in the intervening years. This kind of world that continues without the player is something the Pokemon series handles well when it chooses to engage with it. The Red and Blue games had contained a sense of Kanto as a living place, and seeing that place changed by forces outside anyone's control 3 years later gave the second generation games a texture of consequence that straightforward sequel games rarely produce. Professor Elm's lab in New Bark Town, which serves as the starting point for Gold and Silver, exists in a relationship with Professor Oak's lab in Pallet Town that the games never make explicit, but that the geography implies. These are connected worlds, neighboring regions with a shared history that neither game fully describes, but both games assume. Chandelure, the Ghostfire type introduced in the fifth generation, has Pokédex entries that stand out even in a franchise comfortable with dark implications. The entries describe Chandelure as absorbing the spirits of those lured close by its flickering flames, and then wandering restlessly after the act, the spirit now possessing the flame rather than returning to wherever spirits go. The wandering that results is described as aimless and eternal. This entry specifies that the physical body remains after the spirit is taken, which implies a specific kind of harm that is distinct from anything else the series has described. Most descriptions of dangerous Pokemon involve physical threats. Chandelure's threat is presented as fundamentally different in kind, targeting something that the game's world treats as real and not regenerable. The design itself, which takes a chandelier and gives it a flame-hungry ethereal quality, is elegant enough that the entry's content is easy to approach without alarm. The beautiful and the terrible coexist in the design in a way that feels intentional. Lampent, Chandelure's pre-evolution, is described as haunting hospitals and waiting near those who are about to die. The implication is that it is not causing the deaths it surrounds, but it is drawn to them with a consistency that makes it an omen. The evolution from Lampent to Chandelure represents a transition from passive proximity to active consumption, a progression that is built into the narrative of the evolutionary line if you read the entries in sequence. The mystery of what is beneath Diglett has been part of the franchise's identity since the original games, and it has been carefully maintained through every subsequent appearance the Pokémon has made. In the Pokéthlon and the second generation remakes, Diglett does not jump. In the musicals, in the fifth generation, Diglett does not leave the ground. In the sixth generation games where Pokémon are depicted in three-dimensional models that move and interact with the environment, Diglett is shown from angles that preserve the ambiguity while acknowledging it exists. The anime spent years maintaining the same convention. Every appearance of Diglett showed the creature from above, in its characteristic dirt mound, with nothing visible below the nose. The franchise's ability to sustain this detail across multiple decades, multiple game systems, multiple animation styles, and multiple spin off media represents a form of coordinated consistency that is difficult to achieve in any entertainment property.
Diglett's Pokédex entries do not address the question. They describe the creature's habits, its preferred underground temperature, its sensitivity to light. They describe the fact of its subterranean existence without specifying what the subterranean portion looks like. The closest the franchise has ever come to an official answer was a brief moment in a specific game that depicted what appeared to be Diglett's feet in a humorous context, which was received by the community as both a resolution and a disappointment.
Since the mystery had accumulated more weight than any particular answer could satisfy. The Pokemon Gardevoir was introduced in the third generation as the evolution of Kirlia, itself the evolution of Ralts. The evolutionary line requires a high friendship with the player character to evolve from Ralts to Kirlia at level 20, and Kirlia evolves into either Gardevoir through further leveling, or Gallade through the use of a Dawnstone if the Kirlia is male. Gardevoir's Pokédex entries describe a creature with absolute loyalty to its trainer, capable of warping space to create a small black hole, and willing to do so in defense of the person it is bonded with, even at the cost of its own life. The entries across multiple generations are consistent in this characterization of devotion that is both profound and slightly unnerving in its completeness. The specificity of the sacrifice the entries describe is unusual. Most Pokemon entries that reference loyalty do so in general terms. Gardevoir's entries commit to a specific act and a specific consequence, the creation of a miniature black hole to protect someone, regardless of what that costs. This detail exists without any in-game mechanic that reflects it. No move creates a black hole. No ability triggers a sacrificial state. It is purely a Pokédex claim, which makes it a statement about the creature's nature rather than a description of how the game works. Gallade, Gardevoir's alternate evolution path, is described with a similar loyalty but different expression. Where Gardevoir's entries emphasize psychic power and emotional connection, Gallade's entries describe a creature that fights for those it protects using physical blade attacks extended from its elbows. The same deep loyalty expressed through entirely different means in an evolutionary line that splits based on gender and item use. The Pokemon Rotom occupies a unique position in the franchise as a creature whose base form changes not through evolution, but through possession of specific household appliances. Rotom occupying a microwave becomes Heat Rotom. Rotom occupying a refrigerator becomes Frost Rotom. A lawnmower produces Mow Rotom. A fan produces Fan Rotom. A washing machine produces Wash Rotom. Each of these forms changes Rotom's secondary type while retaining its Electric Ghost primary typing, and each form also gains access to a specific signature move associated with the appliance being possessed. This makes Rotom's type and move pool directly determined by a decision the player makes about which object to place it near, a mechanic that is unusual in the franchise and that has no direct parallel. The Rotom phone introduced in later games as a narrative device is not a battle form of Rotom, but a reference to the franchise's history with the character and its tendency to occupy electronic devices. The entries for Rotom describe a creature that finds joy in inhabiting machinery and disrupting its normal function, which gives the phone concept a specific personality reading. Rotom does not assist with navigation because it is helpful. It assists because inhabiting something useful is a form of mischief with a positive side effect. The Pokédex device in the games where Rotom appears in Alola and beyond is itself a Rotom-inhabited Pokédex, which gives the information source for the game a personality of its own. The Pokédex talks, it has preferences, it reacts to things. This is one of the franchise's more significant shifts in how players receive information about Pokémon, transforming a static database into an opinionated guide. The Pokemon Zoroark has an ability called Illusion that causes it to appear as the last Pokemon in the player's party when sent into battle. This disguise is maintained until Zoroark is hit by a damaging move, at which point the illusion breaks and Zoroark's actual form is revealed. The ability works both in the single-player game and in competitive battles, where knowing whether you are facing the Pokemon you appear to be facing is a genuine strategic question. The first encounter with Zoroark in Pokemon Black and White is designed specifically to demonstrate this ability. The game presents what appears to be a legendary Pokemon from a previous generation, and then reveals it to be a Zoroark maintaining a disguise. The moment is constructed to be a genuine surprise for players who have not seen the creature's abilities described in advance. This is one of the rare occasions in the main series games where the player is explicitly deceived by a game mechanic rather than simply informed of it. Most abilities are described immediately or made visible. The illusion ability is revealed through the experience of being misled, which makes the first encounter with Zoroark a small story told through gameplay rather than dialogue. Zoroark's pre-evolution, is described in its entries as using its illusory abilities to take on human appearance and live among people undetected. This suggests a level of integration between Pokemon and human society that the games rarely explore directly, but frequently gesture toward in their entry text. The Pokeball's internal mechanisms are never fully described in the main series games, but various entries and supplemental materials have addressed the question of what happens to a Pokemon inside a Pokeball in ways that have varied enough over time to leave the question genuinely open. Some descriptions suggest that the Pokemon is converted to energy and stored in that form. Others describe the interior as a comfortable environment tailored to the Pokemon's needs. The question has become more pressing in games that give the player direct access to areas inside Pokeballs, or that feature Pokemon emerging and interacting with their ball in ways that imply they have some awareness of being contained. Amy in X and Y, and its successor, Refresh in Sun and Moon, created modes where Pokemon could be petted and fed and given attention, which implied a level of interiority and sensory experience that the storage's energy model does not naturally accommodate. The games have generally preferred a model that makes the Pokeball experience seem comfortable and voluntary, which supports the broader framework in which the trainer-Pokemon relationship is presented as beneficial rather than exploitative. Pokemon that resist capture are understood as wild and untamed rather than as objecting to captivity on principle, though the black and white games gave a character who read the situation differently a coherent argument. This question does not have an answer that the franchise has committed to permanently, and the exploration of different models in different media suggests that keeping the question open is a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. Pokemon Sun and Moon introduced regional variants, a concept where existing Pokemon that had migrated to the Alola region over generations had developed forms significantly different from those found elsewhere in the world. Alolan Rattata was dark normal type rather than pure normal. Alolan Vulpix was ice type rather than fire. The change was presented as adaptation to new environments and conditions over sufficient generational time. The concept of regional variance expanded significantly in subsequent generations, with Galarian and Hisuian forms following the same principle. In each case, the variant is explained through the specific conditions of the region. Galarian Weezing had been in the Galar region long enough to develop an affinity for absorbing pollution, transforming a pure poison type into a poison fairy type. Hisuian forms reflected the historical Sinnoh region's different ecological conditions from modern Sinnoh. What the regional variant concept allows the franchise to do is revisit older designs with new type combinations and updated abilities without replacing the original forms. Both the original and the variant coexist in the world, distinguished by origin rather than hierarchy. An Alolan Vulpix is not a better or worse Vulpix than a Cantonian one. It is the version that adapted to a specific environment. The concept has been popular enough to become a structural expectation for newer games in the series, with players anticipating that each new region will include variants of some older Pokemon alongside entirely new species. The expectation itself has become part of how the games are received. Pokemon Snap's photography system assigned points based on several criteria that were never fully documented in the game itself. A Pokemon filling a larger portion of the frame scored more highly. A Pokemon facing the camera scored more highly. Multiple Pokemon in a single frame received a bonus. Special poses or behaviors received additional scoring multipliers. The criteria were learnable through experimentation and became the subject of detailed community documentation as players tried to achieve maximum scores on each course. The process of learning what made a good shot without explicit instruction is one of the more effective examples of implicit game design in the franchise's history, teaching through feedback rather than explanation. Some behaviors in Snap could only be triggered by items thrown at the right time in the right location. A Scyther could be photographed emerging from behind a log if a Pester Ball was thrown precisely into the opening. A Porygon could be drawn into an aggressive pose through repeated item throws. These behaviors existed in the game and were discoverable by players who spent enough time in each course to find them. The Mew photographs in the original game, obtained by hitting Mew's bubble with a Pester Ball at the correct moment, were among the most sought-after shots in the game and required specific knowledge of a sequence that the game gave almost no indication existed. The difficulty of the Mew photographs made them a kind of late-game reward for the most patient players, which felt appropriate for a creature that the main series games had similarly reserved for those who looked most carefully. The sound that plays when a Pokémon cries during battle has been one of the series' most consistent elements, even as other aspects of the games changed substantially across hardware generations. The original Game Boy's audio limitations produced the compressed, synthesized cries of the first generation, which have become inseparable from those Pokemon's identities for many players. When Pokemon made the transition to three-dimensional gameplay in X and Y, the cries for original Pokemon were updated to higher quality recordings that captured more detail in the original tones. The update was generally received positively, but a small number of cries, including Pikachu's, were changed more dramatically in ways that sparked discussion about whether the updated version was an improvement or a replacement of something irreplaceable. Pikachu's cry in the original games was a high-pitched, somewhat abstract electronic tone. The updated version incorporated more clearly voice-like qualities, reflecting the character's extensive vocal identity from the animated series. The change illustrated a genuine tension between the game's own established identity for these sounds and the broader franchise identity that had developed around them in other media. Some Pokémon have cries that are pitched or modified versions of other Pokémon's cries, a production practice from the early games where the limited number of original sound samples was extended by applying pitch and speed modifications. Players who have studied the cries carefully have identified which Pokémon share base sounds, creating another layer of connection between creatures that the Pokédex and visible design do not make obvious. The Pokémon Red and Blue games each contained Pokémon that were exclusive to one version, requiring trading with a player who owned the opposite version to complete the Pokédex without owning both cartridges. This design decision, which has been maintained as a structural feature of the main series through every generation, was originally intended to encourage the social dimension of trading that was central to the Game Boy Link cable experience. The version exclusives in the original games were chosen with a degree of symmetry that was not always visually obvious. Each version had exclusive Pokémon at various stages of the power curve, and the distribution of exclusives between the two versions has generally remained balanced enough that neither version is strictly more valuable than the other, purely in terms of which exclusive Pokémon are available. The choice of which starter Pokémon to choose at the beginning of each game is also a version-independent decision that players make without knowing everything they might want to know at the time they make it. The starters are not version exclusives, but their typings create different early game experiences. A player who chooses a water-type starter faces the first gym differently than one who chose a grass type, and this initial difference ripples through the first hours of the game in ways that influence how players relate to their chosen Pokémon. The three-starter selection has been one of the most persistent features of the franchise, with the fire, water, and grass triangle maintained in every main series game. The decision of which to choose is among the first real choices the game asks the player to make, and for many players it has been a surprisingly emotionally resonant one. The Battle Tower, which first appeared in Pokémon Gold and Silver as an optional post-game facility, established the template for a series of competitive facilities that have appeared in various forms across almost every subsequent generation. The core concept is simple. Players bring 3 Pokémon, face a series of increasingly difficult opponents without access to healing between battles, and attempt to extend their win streak as far as possible. The streak mechanic creates a specific kind of tension that standard trainer battles do not. A standard trainer battle carries stakes limited to that single encounter. A battle tower streak carries the accumulated weight of every previous battle, and a loss at a high streak ends everything and requires starting over. This encourages conservative strategic choices and heavily punishes variance. The Battle Tower opponents are controlled by the game's AI rather than by human players, which means they are fully predictable in their behavior patterns once those patterns are learned. Experienced players who have studied the AI's decision tendencies can exploit specific situations where the AI makes suboptimal choices, which is a different kind of strategic knowledge than reading a human opponent. The highest streaks achievable in battle tower facilities have been extensively documented by the competitive community, with specific team compositions and move sequences recorded for achieving results at the numerical limits of what the facility's mechanics allow. Some of these high streak achievements required hundreds of real-time hours and produced results that essentially no casual player would ever come close to encountering. Pokémon Legends. Arceus, released in 2022, represented a more significant departure from the series' established mechanical structure than any previous main series game. Rather than the turn-based encounter system that had been the foundation since the original games, Legends used a real-time approach where Pokémon moved through an explorable environment and players could approach, observe, and attempt to catch them without triggering a formal battle mode. The game was set in a historical version of the Sinnoh region before the events of Diamond and Pearl, which provided a context for the absence of the modern trainer culture. Pokémon were less familiar with humans in this period, and the game described the relationship between people and Pokémon as something being actively developed rather than something already established. This setting allowed the game to address questions about the franchise's conventions that the main series games had generally treated as given. Why do Pokémon cooperate with trainers? How did the system of carrying Pokémon in spherical devices develop? What was the world like before the Pokémon League existed? The answers given were specific to the game's fiction and did not override the established lore of the main series, but they added a historical dimension that the franchise had rarely explored. The game also introduced a system that displayed a Pokémon's complete moveset and breeding information when examining it in the overworld, removing information barriers that had previously required external resources to navigate. The transparency about information that previous games had hidden was one of the more notable quality of life improvements in the series' recent history. The concept of the Pokédex as a complete catalog of all existing Pokémon is one that the games have complicated over time by introducing new Pokémon that exist outside the known regional catalogs. Each new region has its own regional Pokédex, covering the species found in that specific area, and the national Pokédex covers the total known Pokémon population. The gap between these two catalogs has been used narratively in games where a character's ambition to complete the national Pokédex is established as an ongoing project rather than an achievable goal within a single adventure. The expandability of the Pokédex is important to the franchise's structure. A closed catalog would eventually limit the number of stories that could be told and the number of designs that could be introduced. The framing of each regional entry as a subset of a larger unknown total keeps the world feeling genuinely large in a way that a fixed roster could not sustain indefinitely. This framing also allows the games to acknowledge explicitly that there are Pokémon that remain undiscovered, which gives the world a quality of ongoing mystery. The professor at the start of each game, who notes that the world is still full of undiscovered Pokémon, is not simply providing motivation for the player's adventure. They are accurately describing the state of knowledge within the fiction, which happens to correspond to the state of the franchise at the time of the game's release. The distinction between a Pokémon being absent from a regional Pokédex and a Pokémon not yet being discovered is a small one in mechanical terms, but a significant one in terms of what it implies about the world. The former is a limitation of documentation. The latter is a genuine feature of reality within the game's fiction. The animation style of Pokémon sprites has changed significantly across the series, from the static sprite images of the original games to the animated sprites of the later Game Boy Color games, to the full three-dimensional models used in games from X and Y onward. Each transition carried implications for how the creatures were experienced visually and how their personalities were communicated through movement. The animated sprites in gold and silver were among the more impressive technical achievements on Game Boy Color hardware, with each Pokémon assigned a short looping animation that could suggest the creature's energy and personality within a very small number of frames. The Wobbuffet's cheerful bounce, the Umbreon's tail sway, the Steelix's coiled power. These were communicated through animations no more than a few frames long, but were effective enough to become part of how players understood these creatures. The three-dimensional models from X and Y onward allowed each Pokémon to have a continuous idle animation in battle rather than a looping short clip, which gave battles a different ambient quality. The world of the battle felt more alive with dozens of small movements happening simultaneously rather than synchronized with specific moments. The specific designs of Pokémon shifted slightly when translated from sprite to three-dimensional model, with decisions made about proportions and details that the sprite format had left ambiguous. Some creatures emerged from this translation with designs that felt expanded from the sprite. Others felt slightly reduced, the ambiguity of the sprite having accommodated more imagination than the model's specificity could sustain. The move Hyper Beam and its physical counterpart Giga Impact require the user to spend the following turn recharging and unable to act. This makes both moves high risk in competitive contexts. The damage output is among the highest of any normal type move, but the guaranteed vulnerability the following turn creates opportunities for the opponent that offset the damage advantage in most situations. In the original games, Hyper Beam's recharge requirement was waived if it knocked out the opponent. This made it substantially more powerful against already weakened opponents and encouraged its use as a finishing move. The change in later generations to require recharging regardless of knockout outcome significantly reduced the move's competitive viability. This change is one of the more significant mechanical adjustments between the original generation and the second generation that affected competitive outcomes directly. Players who built strategies around the original Hyper Beam found that those strategies required revision when the rule changed, and the debate about whether the change improved or diminished the game was one of the earlier examples of the competitive community engaging with generation-specific rule sets. The normal type, which both Hyper Beam and Giga Impact belong to, is neutral against most types and super effective against none. This means that powerful normal type moves cannot be used to exploit type weaknesses, which is a significant limitation for the move's competitive applications beyond situations where raw power is sufficient, regardless of type matchup. The Pokémon Phoebus is one of the more unusual designs in the franchise's history, described in its entries as an extraordinarily ugly and unimpressive fish that attracts mockery rather than interest from those who encounter it. The contrast between Phoebus and Melodic, its evolved form, is the most extreme transformation in the series in terms of visual appeal. Melodic is described in its entries as possibly the most beautiful Pokémon in existence, capable of calming conflicts and inspiring peace through its appearance. The transformation from Phoebus to Melodic requires a specific condition. In the third generation games, it required raising Phoebus's beauty contest stat to the maximum level by feeding it specific Poffins or Pokéblocks. In later games, this was simplified to holding a specific item while leveling or trading while holding the item. The original beauty-based evolution condition was one of the most difficult single requirements in the franchise's history. Phoebus could only be found by fishing in one of a few specific tiles in a large lake, and those tiles changed location each time the map phrase was set to a new value in the Dewford Town trend mechanic. Finding Phoebus required systematic fishing across every tile in the water, which in practice took considerable time. After finding a Phoebus, Raising its beauty stat to the required level required a specific type of Pokéblock made from rare berries. The entire process from encounter to evolution could take hours. The difficulty of the evolution was the entire point. Melodic required genuine effort in exactly the domain its name and entry described as its essence. Beauty here was something worked toward rather than given. The Pokémon Spirit Ohms number in the Sinnoh Pokédex is 443, which some players have noted as a multiple of 108, the number associated with earthly desires in Buddhist tradition and referenced in the entry texts. The connection is likely intentional, given how consistently the number 108 appears in Spirit Ohms lore. The 4,440 souls bound into the keystone, the specific number of misdeeds committed before the binding, all of these references cluster around the same cultural numerology. This kind of embedded cultural reference is one of the ways the franchise communicates depth to players who are positioned to recognize it while remaining fully functional as a game for players who are not. The number 443 is simply a Pokédex number for most players. For those with the relevant background, it is a deliberate choice that adds a layer to the creature's design. The franchise's relationship with Japanese cultural references and Buddhist iconography runs throughout the series, appearing in the Pokémon names, the regional designs, the typings, and the entry texts in ways that are more accessible to Japanese audiences than to international ones. The localization process has maintained most of these references without explaining them, trusting international players to encounter the cultural detail as a texture rather than a transparent meaning. Some of the most memorable designs in the series draw directly from this cultural background, and understanding the references deepens appreciation for the choices made without those references being necessary for the designs to work as games. There is a fact about Eevee that tends to get mentioned in terms of its evolution options, but less often in terms of what those options imply collectively. Eevee can evolve into 8 different Pokémon as of the current generation, more potential evolution forms than any other Pokémon in the franchise. Each evolution requires different conditions, different items, different relationships, or different environmental contexts. The entries for Eevee describe it as possessing an unstable genetic structure that allows it to evolve in response to the environment around it. This instability is the specific quality that enables its evolutionary flexibility, and the various evolutions are understood as different expressions of what that instability can settle into given the right conditions. The 8 evolutions cover 7 types as of the current generation, covering fire, water, thunder, ice, dark, psychic, grass, and fairy. The absence of specific types from this list, including dragon, ghost, and fighting, has been a topic of sustained fan speculation about whether future games might introduce new Eevee evolutions to cover those gaps. Eevee's position in the franchise has shifted over its history. Initially, it was a relatively uncommon encounter with a notable flexibility. In later games, it was chosen as a starter option, elevated to a prominence that reflected how central the diversity of its evolutions had become to how players understood it. The Pokémon that could become almost anything became one of the faces of a franchise built around the question of what any Pokémon might become. The berry system in the 3rd generation introduced a gardening mechanic that tied item acquisition to a process with real-world time investment. Berries planted in soft soil would grow through multiple stages over hours or days depending on the variety, producing a harvest of multiple berries from a single planted seed. The growth timer ran on the Game Boy Advance's internal clock, which meant the garden continued growing while the game was turned off. Watering berries at specific stages accelerated growth and increased yield. This created a routine for dedicated players that extended outside the game sessions themselves, a reason to return to the game at specific real-world times rather than whenever convenient. The mechanic was not mandatory for completing the game, but was meaningful enough for those who engaged with it that the berry growing system became a significant part of how some players experienced Ruby and Sapphire. The Pokéblock system that used berries as input to create contest-enhancing food for Pokémon connected the gardening mechanic to the contest system, creating a supply chain that rewarded consistent attention with the ingredients needed for contest preparation. A player who maintained their berry garden consistently had a steady supply of Pokéblocks that a player who ignored the system did not. This kind of interlocking system design, where one optional mechanic feeds into another optional mechanic, creates depth that players can choose to engage with or ignore entirely without being unable to complete the main game. The franchise's consistent willingness to include deep optional systems alongside the accessible main game has been part of what gives each generation replay value beyond the story. The Pokémon cast form has a unique ability called Forecast that changes its form and type depending on current weather conditions in battle. In Sunshine, it becomes a fire type with a sun form. In Rain, it becomes a water type with a rainy form. In Hail, it becomes an ice type with a snowy form. In normal conditions, it returns to its base normal type and standard form. This ability was one of the more interesting interactions with the weather system when it was introduced in the third generation, where weather effects had become a significant element of competitive strategy. A cast form on a team using Sunny Day or Rain Dance would change form and type to match the team's strategy, adding a creature whose identity was literally determined by the conditions being exploited. The design of cast form, a small spherical creature whose form reflects different meteorological phenomena, is one of the cleaner expressions of a purely thematic concept in the franchise. It is not based on a specific animal or cultural reference. It is simply a visual representation of weather as a concept made into a creature. Cast form's competitive viability has never matched the thematic interest of its design, primarily because the stat adjustments required to justify building a team around a form-changing creature were not present in its base stats. It has remained a design that is more interesting to think about than to use in battle, which is itself an interesting category of Pokémon to consider, creatures whose concepts exceed their mechanical implementations. The relationship between Pokémon and their trainers, described across countless Pokédex entries, animated episodes, and game story moments, finds some of its clearest expression in the mechanics of friendship. A Pokémon with maximum friendship evolves if the conditions are right, lands critical hits more frequently in some games, survives certain knockout conditions through will alone, and receives damage reduction from moves that target it based on affection. These mechanical expressions of a relationship that is otherwise represented through text and story translate something intangible into a number that affects outcomes. A Pokémon that has been walked with, healed consistently, and fed well performs differently than one that has been neglected, and the difference shows up in statistics that matter in battles that matter. This is not a metaphor. The game literally calculates the quality of the relationship between trainer and Pokémon and applies its measurement to competitive results. The philosophical implications of this design, that care produces better outcomes and that neglect has measurable costs, are consistent with the franchise's general stance on what the trainer-Pokémon relationship is and should be. The friendship system is invisible enough in its moment-to-moment presentation that many players spend entire playthroughs unaware that it is operating continuously in the background. Their Pokémon's happiness is tracked without their knowledge, responding to everything they do. The system does not announce itself. It simply notes what happens and adjusts accordingly. And somewhere in that quiet accumulation of small moments, in the heals and the walks and the levels gained together, something is building. Something that shows up later when it matters, in a way that the player may not be able to fully account for. That is, perhaps, the most honest thing the franchise has found to say about what it is describing. The care that goes unnoticed is still care. It still counts. The move Wish causes the user to close its eyes and make a wish at the end of the turn, which then heals the Pokémon in the user's position at the end of the following turn. If the user switches out before the wish resolves, the incoming Pokémon receives the healing instead. This mechanic makes Wish one of the more tactically flexible recovery moves in the game, allowing a slower Pokémon to pass healing forward to a teammate before retreating. The name and the framing of the move, eyes closed, a wish made, healing arriving a turn later, is one of the gentler pieces of design in a game that is primarily about competitive performance. The move does not describe damage or status or positioning. It describes something hopeful, a small act of optimism that takes a turn to arrive because that is how wishes work. Togekiss, one of the Pokémon that learns Wish most reliably and uses it most effectively in competitive play, is itself a creature whose entries describe it as bringing happiness and good fortune to peaceful places. The combination of a creature associated with joy and a move associated with hope is not accidental. The franchise's best design decisions tend to create these kinds of resonances between mechanical function and thematic identity. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.